Section 1. The show that haunts itself. There is something genuinely strange about sitting down to watch a cartoon about a fat man, his wife, their kids, and a talking dog and walking away feeling like you glimpsed something you were not supposed to see. Not because of a jump scare, not because of anything overtly horrifying on the surface, but because somewhere between the cutaway jokes and the laugh track, a quiet wrongness settles in, the kind that takes a while to name, the kind you only notice when the credits are rolling and the room has gone quiet, and you are sitting there trying to figure out exactly when the show stopped feeling like a cartoon and started feeling like something else entirely. Family Guy first aired on the 31st of January, 1999, right after Super Bowl 33. That placement put it in front of roughly 22 million viewers on its very first night, a number that is almost absurd to think about now. A brand new animated show, one nobody had ever heard of, introduced to over 20 million people in a single broadcast because they happened to have the television on after a football game and had not gotten up to change the channel. It is the kind of lucky break that almost never happens in television, and Seth MacFarlane, a young animator who had studied at the Rhode Island School of Design and cut his teeth on shows like Johnny Bravo and Dexter's Laboratory before pitching his own creation to Fox in May of 1998, knew exactly how to take advantage of it. The show was sharp, strange, and fast. It felt different from everything else on television at the time. It had a specific energy, a confidence in its own weirdness that was hard to place but impossible to ignore. The Griffin family lived in the fictional Rhode Island town of Quahog, a name pulled from the quahog clam, a hard-shell bivalve native to New England waters and a staple of the region's culinary identity. Their address was 31 Spooner Street. The house was yellow, 2 stories, with a blue door and a square patch of lawn that never quite looked like anyone spent time maintaining it. The father, Peter, worked at the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory in the early seasons before eventually landing at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, a job that seemed perfectly calibrated to his personality, placing him adjacent to the product he most enjoyed consuming. The mother, Lois, gave piano lessons out of the house and kept the household from falling completely apart through what appeared to be sheer force of patient determination, though the seams showed more and more as the years went on. The oldest daughter, Meg, navigated the social minefields of high school with the grace of someone who steps on every mine with both feet and then apologizes for the noise. Their son Chris was awkward and gentle and mostly harmless, moving through his days in a pleasant fog. The baby, Stewie, was plotting the destruction of Western civilization from his crib while simultaneously scheming to murder his mother. And the dog Brian drank martinis, drove a car, read serious literature, and nursed a novel he could never seem to finish. On paper, this is a sitcom, a broad, cartoonish, boundary-pushing sitcom, one that very deliberately said things on broadcast television that television had not said before, one that drew immediate and sustained fire from the Parents Television Council and accumulated FCC complaints like a trophy collection, but a sitcom. All the same. Family, neighborhood, the same problems week after week, resolved by the end of the episode, reset by the time the next one starts. The machinery of the American family comedy, just with more cutaway gags and considerably less accountability. But here is where things get genuinely interesting. The longer you look at Family Guy not casually, not with half your attention while scrolling on a phone, but with the kind of close, specific attention you give to something that does not quite add up, the more you notice the seams. The places where the cheerful suburban comedy frays at the edges and something much darker bleeds through. The inconsistencies that are too consistent to be accidents. The patterns that recur with too much regularity to be coincidence. The moments where the show seems to be saying something under the thing it is actually saying out loud. The way you sometimes catch a person telling you a story and realize there is another story beneath it that they have not yet decided whether to tell you. This is the territory that fan theories live in. And Family Guy, more than almost any other animated comedy in television history, has generated theories that are genuinely unsettling in their internal logic. Not because they are outrageous, plenty of fan theories are just silly, the creative equivalent of someone at a party trying to convince you that a popular movie has a hidden meaning it almost certainly does not have. But the best Family Guy theories are different. They actually work. They slot into the existing material of the show with a precision that feels earned rather than forced. They answer questions the show itself never bothered to ask. They explain contradictions the show never bothered to resolve. And in doing so, they transform what looked like a fairly simple animated comedy into something that sits with you longer than it should. This is going to take a while, and I want you to know going in that that is the whole point. This is meant to be something you sink into, something comfortable and slow and rich with detail, the kind of thing you put on when you want your mind to wander through a dark but interesting place without going anywhere too frightening. Family Guy is a cartoon. Whatever truths might be buried inside it, they exist at a comfortable remove from reality, behind the buffer of animation and comedy and the deliberately absurd. But they are still truths worth examining carefully, because the theories that have built up around this show say something real about what it is doing and why. After over 25 years on television, it still makes people feel something they cannot entirely explain. We are going to walk through 12 major areas. Each one is a different angle on the same show, a different set of questions applied to the same characters and the same yellow house on the same fictional Rhode Island street. Some of these theories are decades old, circulating through fan forums long before Reddit existed and long before TikTok made the concept of the viral fan theory into a cultural artifact in its own right. Some of them are newer, built from material the show has introduced in its later seasons, which have become increasingly willing to canonize things that earlier seasons left as throwaway jokes. And some of them are things you might piece together yourself, once you start looking at the show from a slightly different angle than the one it officially wants you to occupy. I want to set one expectation clearly before we begin. This is not a rip on Family Guy. The theories that have grown around this show are actually a testament to the opposite. They are evidence that it created characters and a world detailed enough, internally complex enough, that 25 years of sustained audience attention has produced a secondary mythology of real depth and genuine darkness. The show earned its theories by being interesting in ways it probably did not fully intend. The best storytelling creates a world just complex enough that people can read things into it the writers never put there, and then those readings turn out to be more coherent than anyone expected, because the world was real enough to contain them. So settle in, let the room get quiet around you, let everything slow down. We are going to look at one of America's most familiar animated families, and by the time we are done, you might not find them quite so familiar as you did when we started. Before we go any further, drop a comment below and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is right now. There is something I genuinely love about knowing that people across completely different countries and time zones, some with the lights off at 2 in the morning, some in the middle of a bright afternoon with something warm to drink, are all here for the same strange conversation. And if you have not subscribed yet, it costs nothing and helps more than you know. Section 2. The Griffin House is a prison. The house at 31 Spooner Street is described, on the surface of things, as the home of the Griffin family, a yellow house in a middle-class Rhode Island neighborhood, sitting on a street so unremarkable that its very name has the quality of a street that might appear in a dream familiar, without being specific, present without being truly there. The Swansons live next door. Quagmire is just down the road. Cleveland Brown lived across the street for years before he moved away to Virginia. It is the kind of neighborhood you would call entirely ordinary, the kind of street you pass through and forget about 20 minutes later. But look at that house more carefully. Think about what actually happens inside it across over 25 years of episodes, not one or two in isolation, but the entire accumulated record of everything that house has been the setting for across more than 400 episodes of television. People die inside that house and then appear alive in the following episode, with no explanation offered and none apparently necessary. Injuries that would be fatal under any conceivable reading of physics injuries that the show draws with specific clinical detail in its later seasons, with exposed bones and blood and the texture of genuine bodily harm, resolve themselves before the next scene, without any healing process in between. Characters age through a season and then stop aging. The same arguments between Peter and Lois play out with the same structure, the same emotional beats, and the same nominal resolution, season after season, without ever actually being resolved. The Griffins fight, they make up, they fight again. The needle does not move. Nobody on Spooner Street moves away permanently. Nobody gets older in the biological sense that matters. Nobody grows in the psychological sense in a way that carries forward from one season to the next. The house remains the same. The neighborhood remains the same. The street outside the living room window looks functionally identical in Season 22 as it did in Season 1. And the seasons themselves, Rhode Island winters, New England autumns, The summers that should be hot and humid, and particular to that specific corner of the world, appear and disappear without any real connection to the passage of time felt inside the walls of that yellow house. There is a theory that has been assembling itself in the fan community for years, built piece by piece from the structural contradictions of the show and from the patterns visible when you look at 25 seasons as a single document rather than a sequence of individual stories. The theory goes like this: the Griffin House is not a home. It is a container, a loop, a space specifically constructed so that nothing inside it can genuinely change, can genuinely grow, can genuinely escape. The people inside it are not living freely. They are cycling endlessly through a program designed to maintain rather than to resolve. To understand why this theory resonates as strongly as it does, you have to sit with what it actually means for time to behave the way it does in Family Guy. The show premiered in 1999. Season 24 began airing in October of 2025. That is more than 25 years of continuous broadcast, more than 400 episodes, representing one of the longest uninterrupted runs in American animated television history. And yet Stewie Griffin is still 1 year old. Meg is still a teenager in high school. Peter still works at the brewery. The house has not changed in any meaningful way. The furniture is the same. The neighbors are the same. Everything that should have changed has simply not changed. Other long-running animated comedies operate this way. The Simpsons has been running since 1989, and Bart Simpson is still 10 years old. South Park handles aging inconsistently and resets. Perpetual Present is a convention of the format, a pragmatic production choice made by showrunners who understand that character aging creates continuity problems and limits storytelling options. So there are entirely non-mysterious explanations for the frozen timeline. But Family Guy is a show that has, within its own internal narrative and accepted as canonical fact of the world it depicts, introduced time travel as a real and functional technology. It has introduced the multiverse as a genuinely navigable space. It has depicted real death and real grief. Brian's death in Season 12 was not a comedic throwaway. It was an emotionally serious event that the show treated with genuine weight. It has shown consequences. It has shown that actions matter within the logic of this world. These are not decorative elements. They are load-bearing parts of the show's internal mythology. So when the world refuses to change, when it cycles back to its baseline state with the reliability of a machine returning to its resting position, the anomaly is more conspicuous in Family Guy than in comparable animated shows. Because those shows never gave their characters a time machine and then expected you to believe that time worked normally. Family Guy gave Stewie a time machine, showed you in loving detail exactly what that machine could do to the fabric of reality, and then went right back to acting as though nothing in the show had meaningful permanence. The purgatory theory emerged from this observation and has been developed with real care by various corners of the fan community. The core of it is elegant and genuinely strange in roughly equal measure. The Griffin family is dead. All of them, or at least most of them. They died at some point before or during the events of the show. The exact nature of the death varies depending on which version of the theory you encounter, and what we are watching is not their life, but their afterlife. A specifically constructed purgatory, tailored to the particular nature of each character's failings and the specific shape of each character's suffering, in which they are trapped in a permanent loop, cycling endlessly through variations of the same situations without being able to grow past them, move through them, or find their way to whatever lies on the other side. The evidence for this theory is not circumstantial in the way most fan theories are. It is woven through how each character is constructed at a structural level, through the specific shape of each character's suffering, in a way consistent enough to suggest either deliberate authorial intention or the kind of accidental coherence that occasionally emerges from a show that has been running long enough to develop its own internal logic beneath the official. 1. Start with Stewie. In the Purgatory reading, Stewie is an evil genius, a being of extraordinary intelligence who has demonstrated the capacity to understand theoretical physics, to construct technology decades or centuries ahead of his time, to comprehend the nature of the multiverse and navigate it with real confidence. His mind is, within the world of this show, one of the most remarkable instruments ever to have existed, and that mind is housed permanently, irrevocably, in the body of a 1-year-old infant. He cannot speak to most people around him in a way they can understand. He cannot drive. He cannot access most of the world without assistance from people who do not even know they are assisting a genius. He cannot leave the house under his own power without being scooped up and returned within minutes, treated like the baby he anatomically is, regardless of what his brain is producing. If you were tasked with designing a punishment precisely calibrated to cause maximum suffering for a being of exceptional intelligence, you would do exactly this. You would give them the mind and take away every other resource necessary to exercise it. You would trap the most capable brain in the most helpless body. You would make sure that every day, every hour, involves some new reminder that the power of the mind cannot compensate for the powerlessness of the form it inhabits. Stewie's purgatory is not a location, it is a condition. The genius is the punishment and the body is the cage. Now consider Lois. She was born into the Pewter-Schmidt family, one of the wealthiest dynasties in the show's Rhode Island setting. Her father, Carter Pewter-Schmidt, has the kind of wealth that does not just buy things but buys outcomes, that reshapes the world to accommodate its holders' preferences. He plays poker with Ted Turner and Bill Gates. He has owned CNN. He has the financial leverage to make real problems disappear and has demonstrably done so on the show, with matters ranging from mere inconvenience to genuine atrocity. One storyline reveals that Carter gave an entire town cancer through chemical waste disposal and then refused to make the cure public because doing so would have been financially inconvenient. Growing up inside that family, Lois had access to every resource of comfort, opportunity, and possibility that American wealth at its most extreme can provide. And she chose Peter Griffin. She walked away from all of it to marry a working-class man who spends most of his free income on beer at a bar, who holds a job that barely sustains the household's basic needs, who makes decisions of a quality so consistently poor that the show has run for 25 years on the premise that his poor decisions are an infinite renewable resource. She lives in a modest 2-story house. She clips coupons. She gives piano lessons to neighborhood children to supplement Peter's income. In the purgatory reading, this is the punishment. She had everything and chose to give it away, and the afterlife gives her the consequences of that choice in permanent, unending detail. Every season is another loop of the same economic constraint. Every episode is another iteration of managing a household on Peter's income and with Peter's judgment. The wealth she walked away from is not gone from the narrative. Carter Pewter-Schmidt appears regularly as a reminder of what she could have had, but it is always just out of reach. Offered and then withdrawn. The possibility of comfort, perpetually denied. That is a very specific kind of torment. Brian's situation in the purgatory reading is perhaps the most elegantly constructed cruelty of the set. He is the most intellectually sophisticated member of the Griffin household, well-read, articulate, capable of speaking with genuine authority on literature, film, and philosophy. He wants, more than anything, to be taken seriously as a thinker and a writer, to have his intelligence recognized in the outside world as something that matters. He has this aspiration with a kind of sincerity that the show occasionally allows through, even in its most comedic treatments of his character. And he is a dog. Not in the Family Guy universe's internal sense, where being a dog is not a significant social disadvantage because everyone in the show treats him as a person anyway. But in the broader, real-world sense, the sense that anyone outside the Griffin household or their immediate social circle would register. He is a dog with a martini glass. He is a dog pitching a novel to publishers. He is a dog trying to be taken seriously as an intellectual. The intelligence he possesses is real, but the form it occupies undercuts every expression of it. His prison is the gap between what he is and how he is perceived, a gap that cannot be closed because it is built into his body, because no amount of sophisticated conversation can change what he looks like to the world beyond Spooner Street. Peter occupies perhaps the most interesting position in the purgatory framework, because his punishment is also the hardest to recognize as one. His specific failing, in the show's moral accounting, is willful ignorance, the choice, made consistently across his entire depicted life, to not think about consequences, to not grow, to take the path of least resistance even when that path causes real harm to the people around him. He is not stupid in the way the show sometimes presents him. He is a man who has chosen stupidity because it costs less, and the purgatory locks him into that choice, gives him the results of it in permanent and accumulating detail. And here is the particular cruelty: it makes him the center of a world that validates his self-image as a basically good person who means well, season after season, regardless of the evidence. His punishment is not that he suffers. His punishment is that he never has to face what he actually is. Meg's situation is the most overtly cruel in the Purgatory reading, and it is worth dwelling on because it is the element that lands the hardest. Every other character has a punishment that maps onto a recognizable failing. But Meg, what is Meg's failing? The show does not give her one in the early seasons. She is a normal, ordinary, somewhat boring teenage girl who wants the things that normal, ordinary teenage girls want. She wants to be liked. She wants her parents to be proud of her. She wants a social life, a friend group, maybe a boyfriend who is not terrible to her. She wants to feel like she belongs somewhere. These are not failings. These are the most basic human desires that exist, the ones so fundamental that they barely register as wants. They are more like the baseline expectations that any person brings to the experience of being alive. And in the Purgatory reading, the torment is that those baseline expectations are never met. The desire to be seen and loved, placed permanently and specifically out of reach. Her family does not hate her. In the way that hatred typically works, there is no great crime, no single act of betrayal that precipitated it. They simply cannot register her as someone who matters. She exists in the household as a function, as the person who absorbs excess frustration, who is present without being valued, who is there so that other people have somewhere to put the things they cannot put anywhere else. Her purgatory is invisibility, the need for love, met only with absence. The distinction between purgatory and something darker, something closer to the genuinely punitive end of the theological spectrum, is a distinction the theory has to make eventually. And it matters. Purgatory implies the possibility of eventual resolution. The sentence ends when the lesson is learned. The soul grows past its failing and moves through. The darker version offers no such possibility. In the darker version, the loop is permanent. The characters do not grow because growth would end the sentence, and the sentence is not designed to end. The evidence for the harder reading is in what happens when the show occasionally allows characters to grow, to change, to learn something meaningful, and then immediately resets them to where they started. This happens with disturbing regularity. Peter learns something real about himself in an episode about his abusive upbringing and reconciles genuinely with Meg. The next episode, nothing has changed. Brian has a moment of genuine self-awareness and acts from a place of real kindness. The following episode he has forgotten entirely. Stewie opens up to Brian in a moment of remarkable vulnerability. The season moves on and the closeness does not accumulate into anything that permanently changes their dynamic. In the Purgatory as temporary reading, this is just the show's episodic structure preventing character development. In the darker reading, it is the mechanism of the loop asserting itself. You cannot grow in a loop. The loop prevents it by design. Every lesson evaporates before it can be absorbed because the system is designed to evaporate lessons. Every moment of genuine connection dissolves before it can alter the relationship because the system is designed to dissolve connections before they become permanent. The address has attracted attention in fan communities. Spooner Street. To be spooned along is to be kept moving, kept engaged, without ever arriving anywhere. The residents are always being kept just interested enough, just warm enough, just hopeful enough that something might change, and nothing ever does. The street gives them just enough to keep them going and no more. The physical impossibility of the house itself adds another layer. The structure has been burned down, flooded, collapsed, and structurally compromised in multiple episodes, and by the following week it is always whole and unchanged. In the Purgatory framework, the indestructibility of the house is the indestructibility of the container. The container cannot be destroyed because it serves a function. It holds something, and it will hold that something for as long as the sentence requires, regardless of what is done to it in the interim. There is no exit from 31 Spooner Street. Not in any permanent sense. Characters have tried to leave in various ways across various storylines. Brian has pursued opportunities away from the household and always returned. Peter has been separated from his family and always found his way back. Meg has had moments where the show offered her a genuine path towards something different, a life outside the yellow house that might actually sustain her. None of them have ever taken it and kept it. The orbit always brings them home. The most disturbing observation the Purgatory theory makes is about the nature of the mechanism that maintains the loop. It does not appear to be external. There are no obvious wardens, no gates, no explicit supernatural force compelling the characters to return to baseline after each episode. The mechanism seems to be internal, something in the characters themselves that draws them back. that makes the baseline feel like home even when home is a place of harm. Something that makes escape feel like loss rather than liberation. Whatever that mechanism is, call it habit, call it fear, call it the incomprehensible human tendency to prefer the familiar over the unknown, even when the familiar is causing damage. It is real. It is documented in the show across 25 years of episodes. And the fan theory that identified it and gave it the name of purgatory did not invent the pattern. It just named something that was already there, already operating, already visible to anyone paying the right kind of attention. Section 3. Peter Griffin is already dead. Of all the theories that have grown up around Family Guy, this is the one that went genuinely viral. It was first posted to Reddit's fan theory community in August of 2012, where it accumulated significant discussion before settling into the broader ecosystem of fan theory culture. Then, in late 2022, it found TikTok, where it spread rapidly among a generation of younger viewers who had grown up with the show and experienced the particular vertigo of being told to look something up because it was scary, and then realizing the scary thing was not a monster or a horror image, but a recontextualization of something entirely familiar, something they had been watching their whole lives without seeing it clearly. Because that is what this theory does. It does not introduce anything supernatural that the show has not already established. It does not require any impossible premises or any information the audience does not already possess. All it does is offer a different frame for the events we have already watched, a different key in which to read the song, and in doing so, it transforms a familiar cartoon family into something genuinely, quietly heartbreaking. The theory goes like this. In the real world, the actual reality that exists beneath the events depicted in the show Meg Griffin was a popular, beautiful, socially successful teenager. Not the awkward, invisible, chronically mocked girl the show presents. Not the girl who gets forgotten in family photographs and left off invitation lists and abandoned at fire stations as an infant. A real, recognizable, functioning young person. Someone people noticed and wanted to be around. Someone who navigated high school with relative ease and came out the other side with her sense of self more or less intact. Chris, on the other hand, was born with a genuine and significant intellectual disability, the result of oxygen deprivation during delivery. Not the bumbling, spacey, essentially functional teenager the show presents. In reality, Chris's impairment was real and substantial, a condition that required specific support and created specific challenges for the family, challenges that would have shaped every aspect of how the Griffins understood themselves and their future. One night, Meg took Chris to a party. She was older, she had access to a car, and she drove them. She had also been drinking, which a teenager at a party might do, which teenagers at parties do with terrible and regular frequency, and usually survive, except for the times they do not. The accident that followed killed both of them. Lois was pregnant at the time. She was carrying the child who would become Stewie. The grief of losing 2 children, of receiving the call on a night that had begun entirely normally, was more than she could hold. Lois took her own life. She died before Stewie was born. The pregnancy ended with her. Peter Griffin survived. Physically, his body continued to function in all the ways bodies function. But the person who walked out of the hospital that night was not the same person who had walked into it. The original Peter, whoever he had been before, was gone in some essential way. And what replaced him could not hold reality together in its original shape, could not find purchase on a world in which all of this had actually happened. He went somewhere. A facility perhaps, or perhaps just deeper into the interior of his own psychology, in whatever direction a mind travels when it can no longer find its footing in the external world. And inside whatever space he now occupied, he built another world, a world where his family was still alive, where the accident had not happened, where he could walk downstairs every morning and find Lois making coffee in the kitchen, his children arguing over the remote control, his dog reading a newspaper in the armchair. Everything we watch in Family Guy across all its seasons, all its episodes, all its cutaway gags and chicken fights and musical numbers is the interior world of a grieving man who has gone completely and irrevocably insane. A constructed reality. A prison he built himself because the alternative was a reality he could not survive. The theory explains the show's most persistent inconsistencies with almost unsettling precision. In the real world, Meg was popular and beautiful. In Peter's constructed fantasy, she is her exact opposite, awkward, invisible, universally disliked, the target of cruelty from the people who should protect her most. Because Peter cannot forgive her. She drove the car. She made the choice that killed his children and his wife. He loves her in the way a person loves someone they cannot stop blaming, which is not love at all, but a kind of permanent wound that exists where love used to be. He needs her to be there, so she is included in the fantasy. But the part of his mind that remembers what she did keeps poisoning how he imagines her. She is punished endlessly by the father who needed her to survive but could never stop resenting her for surviving. Chris's intellectual disability, which in reality was significant, becomes inverted in Peter's fantasy. In the show, Chris is bumbling and easily confused but essentially functional. Peter cannot bear to imagine his son as severely impaired. The disability was real, and it was one of the things he might have carried guilt about, wondering if different choices could have produced a different outcome. In the fantasy, he softens it, keeps the spaciness, the occasional confusion, but elevates Chris enough that he is not the son Peter feels he failed to adequately protect. In the fantasy, Chris is just a little lost, lovably lost, not damaged. Stewie is the most revealing case in the entire theory. Lois was pregnant when she died. Peter never met this child. He never held him. He never learned his name, or looked into his face, or had any actual information about who this person was going to be. What Peter had was the anticipation of a child who was never born a space in the shape of a person that was never filled by an actual person. And when a grieving, broken man who has lost everything constructs a fantasy world to live inside, what does he do with that empty space? He fills it with everything he ever hoped his child could be. He makes him extraordinary. He makes him one of the most remarkable minds of his generation, an evil genius, a baby supervillain. Not because evil genius is a comfortable or soothing fantasy, but because there is something in the construction of that character that represents not evil but power, the power that Peter could never give his children, the protection he could not provide, imagined as something fantastic and strange and totally impossible that makes the emptiness feel less empty by filling it with something larger than life. Stewie's desire to kill Lois is the most psychologically precise element of this theory, and the detail that makes it feel most complete. Peter loved Lois. He loves her desperately in the fantasy, in the way a person loves someone who is gone and who they are reconstructing from the fragments of memory available to them. But part of him is also angry at her. She died. She left. She took the child that was going to complete their family, and she left before he had the chance to meet him. And the grief at that is real. And it has nowhere to go in a fantasy that requires Lois to be present and whole and loving. So it gets displaced. It goes into Stewie. The anger that Peter cannot consciously direct at the wife he loves because loving her and being angry at her simultaneously is more than the broken machinery of his mind can contain. That anger wears the face of a baby boy and plots the death of the mother who left. Brian, the dog, is explained within this framework in a way that is quietly touching beneath its strangeness. In reality, Brian is simply a dog, a real dog, with a dog's intelligence and a dog's way of being in the world. And when Peter was at his lowest, in the wreckage of everything, this dog was there. Dogs do this. They sit beside grief they cannot understand, present and quiet and loyal, in a way that humans sometimes cannot manage because humans have their own grief and their own needs and their own inability to simply be present without agenda. Brian was present. And Peter's mind, constructing a world that needed a reasonable voice, a steady presence, an intelligent companion, elevated Brian, made him into what was needed. The one character in the household who can see clearly is the one character who has no actual stake in any of it, because he is a dog who was transposed into the role of a person by a man who needed someone to play that role. The friends Cleveland, Quagmire, and Joe Swanson are also accounted for in the theory with a detail that makes the whole construction feel more real and more devastatingly sad. In reality, these men visit Peter in the facility where he is being cared for. They sit with him, they talk to him about the neighborhood, about their own lives, about the ordinary texture of the days that are continuing without him. And those visits, filtered through Peter's fractured perception, become the versions of those men that appear in the show. Joe Swanson is described to Peter during these visits as a strong, heroic family man who lives across the street, a police officer, someone who represents the ideals of protection and service that Peter may feel he personally failed to embody. Peter takes that description and builds Joe into the fantasy as the idealized version of the neighbor as moral anchor he wishes he had been. Joe's wheelchair, the disability that the show increasingly uses as a comedic target in later seasons, is a detail that carries its own weight in this reading. The idealized Joe, the strong, heroic man Peter was told about, exists alongside the diminished Joe that Peter's deeper self keeps intruding on the image. The wheelchair is the intrusion of something real into a fantasy that was supposed to be cleaner. Cleveland is the most interesting case among the friends. He visits Peter regularly, engaging with the details of Peter's imagined world, following along with it as a way of maintaining the connection to a friend who is lost. But at some point, and this explains the Cleveland show, the spin-off that Cleveland's departure from the neighborhood created the engagement starts to cost Cleveland something. He is spending so much time inside Peter's fantasy that the border between what is real and what he is participating in begins to blur. He takes a break. He steps back from the visits. And Peter, who needs Cleveland in the story but cannot force him to remain in it, projects Cleveland's absence as a departure, a whole separate narrative, an entire other life lived in another city, following the logic of someone who left rather than someone who simply stopped visiting. The Cleveland show is the story Peter tells himself about where his friend went when he stopped coming. The detail about Peter's own characterization within the fantasy is the most quietly devastating element of the whole theory. Because, in reality, Peter is not the catastrophically incompetent figure the show presents. He is an ordinary, reasonably intelligent man who has experienced catastrophic loss. The incompetence, the willful stupidity, the almost supernatural talent for causing accidental destruction, none of this is who Peter actually is. It is who he imagines himself as, within the constructed world. It is a punishment he inflicts on himself. Because somewhere in the breakdown, Peter decided something about himself. He decided that a man who could have prevented what happened, who could have driven Meg to that party himself, who could have been more present, more attentive, who could have made any number of different choices on any number of different nights, does not deserve to be imagined as smart or capable or reliable. He makes himself incompetent in the fantasy because incompetence excuses failure in a way that competence does not. An idiot's failures are expected. A reasonably intelligent man who simply was not paying attention, that is something harder to live with. So Peter removes the intelligence, removes the competence, gives himself the character of someone who could not have done better because he was not equipped to do better. Peter makes himself an idiot as an act of self-punishment. And the show runs for 25 years on the premise that this punishment is sufficient, that the cartoon buffoon stumbling through a fantasy family is what Peter Griffin deserves to be, and that the stumbling will continue indefinitely because there is nothing in the logic of the loop that would bring it to an end. The moments in the show where Peter breaks from that characterization, where he demonstrates genuine capability, where something passes between him and Lois that has actual weight and history and earned feeling, where he shows real love for his family in a way that feels completely different from his usual comedic incompetence. Those are the moments when the real Peter surfaces. When the man beneath the construct has enough proximity to the surface to feel something like himself. And then the wall thickens again. Peter stumbles over something entirely avoidable. The laugh track fills the room. The machine continues. Section 4. Meg is the only real person. Step away from the Peter is insane theory for a moment and approach the show from a completely different angle. Because there is a competing theory that positions things very differently, one that makes its own kind of internal sense when you look at Family Guy's structural peculiarities through a different lens entirely. What if Meg is not Peter's projection of guilt? What if Meg is the only one of them who is real? This theory is less about tragedy and more about close reading about the specific ways different characters are written and what those differences reveal about the underlying architecture of the show's world. It begins with an observation that sounds simple but becomes more complex the longer you sit with it. Meg is the only member of the Griffin family who consistently responds to events the way a real person would. She gets embarrassed in a way that carries weight. She experiences sustained emotional pain that accumulates across time rather than resetting between episodes. She develops genuine attachments to people and carries the weight of those attachments even when the show does not acknowledge them. She has desires that persist between episodes even when the narrative does not follow them up. She is, in the most precise functional sense, the only character who seems to inhabit time as a continuous experience, rather than as a series of disconnected episodic presents. Everyone else resets. Peter, Lois, Chris, Stewie, Brian, Their emotional states are largely determined by the demands of whatever episode they happen to be in. They can feel grief or joy or fear within the contained space of a given story, but they carry almost none of it forward into the next one. At the beginning of each episode, they are essentially new versions of themselves, returned to their baseline configurations, unburdened by anything that came before. This is a convention of episodic storytelling, and there are practical production reasons for it. But in Family Guy's case, given the show's own internal logic about consequences and about what time can and cannot do, the reset is conspicuous in a way it is not on other shows. Meg does not reset in the same way. Her suffering is cumulative in a way the show sometimes accidentally acknowledges and sometimes deliberately depicts. Her resentment builds. Her episodes of desperation are connected to previous episodes of desperation in a way that suggests continuous experience rather than episodic reset. When she finally explodes in the Seahorse Seashell Party episode in Season 10, when she confronts her family during a hurricane and delivers a detailed, accurate, emotionally devastating account of what they have done to her, the power of that moment comes precisely from the fact that it has been earned. The audience has watched her absorb the damage she is now cataloging. The speech works because the damage is real and cumulative, because Meg has been experiencing it as a continuous person in continuous time rather than as a character who resets between episodes. She remembers. She carries the weight. She is, functionally, the only character in the show living in something that resembles continuous time. The theory that has grown from this observation holds that the world of Family Guy is not a single coherent shared reality, but a kind of subjective construct, a world generated and maintained by a consciousness, reflecting the interior logic of that consciousness rather than any objective external truth. And when you look for the consciousness most capable of generating the specific world we are watching, the most internally consistent candidate is not Peter and not Stewie, but Meg, because the world of Family Guy, assessed from Meg's perspective and no other, is entirely, perfectly internally consistent. It makes complete sense as a projection of her experience. It is a world in which she is invisible, in which her pain is treated as comedy by the people around her, in which her desire to be loved is met, consistently and without exception, with either active cruelty or passive indifference, in which even the moments when she is acknowledged tend to resolve in ways that leave her worse off than she was before. This is a recognizable interior landscape. This is the specific world that exists inside a person who has been made to feel, over a sustained and unbroken period of time, that they do not matter. The world of Family Guy is what the world feels like when you are Meg Griffin. In this reading, the rest of the Griffins are not fully real people. They are emotional constructs, vivid, internally complex constructs, but constructs nonetheless generated by Meg's psyche as a way of modeling and processing her experience. Peter is the personification of thoughtless authority. He is the parental figure who causes harm without reflection, whose love is real in some abstract sense but whose capacity to express it in ways that do not cause damage is essentially absent. He is the person you love and are hurt by simultaneously, the person whose cruelty does not come from malice but from a kind of permanent incapacity for the attention that love actually requires in practice. Lois is the more complex version of the same figure, the parent who should be an ally, who has the capacity to be an ally, who occasionally demonstrates that capacity in individual moments, but who defers to the dominant authority and allows the harm to continue because confronting it would require a kind of courage she has not found. The parent who knows and does nothing, which is often a more painful figure than the parent who does not know at all. Chris is the sibling who is simply oblivious, who exists in the same environment, breathes the same air, sits at the same table, and cannot see what is happening right beside him. This is also a recognizable figure from the landscape of family dysfunction, the person adjacent to harm who is somehow, inexplicably, insulated from registering it. Not through cruelty or design, but through the specific direction their attention naturally points. Stewie is the internal voice, the part of Meg that rehearses impossible plans, that imagines escape routes, that fantasizes about power and the satisfaction of turning the whole world upside down. The baby with the ray gun and the time machine is the part of any teenager who has been hurt enough to think about what it would feel like to strike back, made literal, given form and voice, allowed to exist as a full character in the world Meg is generating. And Brian is the one real relationship that Meg has. Which is why when you look at how the show writes Brian's interactions with Meg, there is a quality different from his interactions with the other characters. He is the one who occasionally treats her like a person. Not consistently, the later seasons have not been kind to that aspect of his characterization, but with more regularity than anyone else in the household. Brian is real in Meg's world because Brian is the one element of her experience that has occasionally provided what the rest of it denies her: the sense of being seen. The banned episode, Partial Terms of Endearment, which aired in international markets but was pulled from American broadcast, contains a detail that this theory latches onto. In that episode, Lois mentions, in what the show frames as a throwaway joke, the possibility that Meg gave birth to Stewie. The show retreats from this immediately, treating it as an absurd gag that does not deserve to be taken seriously. But the seed is planted. And if Meg is actually Stewie's biological mother, if the show planted this deliberately in an episode it then suppressed, then the entire configuration of the Griffin household takes on a significantly darker shape. Stewie's hostility toward Lois would be recontextualized entirely. The early Stewie's obsession with murdering his mother would be directed at the wrong target if Lois is not his mother, and the displacement of that hostility could be read as the psyche's attempt to process a truth cannot consciously access. The official family structure in which Meg is a sibling rather than a parent, in which the real relationship between them has been buried under a fiction, is exactly the kind of institutional lie that produces the specific quality of damage visible in both characters across the show's run. The fourth wall breaks that Meg occasionally performs the moments when she looks directly at the camera in a way that feels slightly different from the show's standard visual language. The pauses that are slightly longer than comedic timing requires have been read by some theorists as moments when the generator of the world is visible. When Meg, as the consciousness behind the construct, momentarily surfaces and looks out through her own creation at whoever is watching, these moments are easy to dismiss as animation choices. They are also possible to read as a character who knows, on some level, that she is both inside a story and telling it simultaneously. The question the theory ultimately asks is why? Why would Meg generate this world? Why would the consciousness constructing this specific reality choose to construct one in which she suffers so persistently? And the answer the theory offers is the same one visible in the Seahorse Seashell Party speech. In the moment when Meg takes back everything she said and returns to her role as the family's emotional lightning rod. Because it is her family. Because proximity to them, even in this broken, damaging form, is preferable to the alternative. Because a world in which she is present, even if she is invisible within it, is better than a world in which she is entirely absent. And because somewhere in the construct is the possibility, however remote, of the love she is building the whole thing to access. The most human thing about this theory is not that Meg is the only real person. It is that she keeps making the world anyway, keeps showing up inside it, keeps trying episode after episode, season after season in the specific and exhausted way that people who have been hurt badly enough keep trying anyway. Not because they have been given a reason to, but because the desire to matter is more durable than the damage done to it. Section 5. Stewie's Genocide Timeline. Stewie Griffin is 1 year old. He weighs approximately 16 pounds. He needs his diaper changed with regularity and cannot perform this task for himself. He eats pureed food because his digestive system has not yet developed sufficient capacity for solids. He sleeps in a crib with a mobile above it. He requires supervision at all times because without it, he might crawl into traffic or consume something non-edible or fall down a flight of stairs, all of which are genuine and continuous risks for creatures of his size and developmental stage. He also built a working time machine that he has used dozens of times across the show's run. He accidentally created the Big Bang. He is his own ancestor. He has traveled to Renaissance Italy, to the Stone Age, to Nazi Germany, and to an unimaginable number of alternate universes. He has killed people on screen. He has let people die because intervening would have inconvenienced him. He has erased and restored timelines. And there is very good reason to believe, based on the cumulative logic of everything the show has canonically put on screen, that Stewie Griffin has been responsible for the deaths of more people across more timelines than any other character in the history of animated television. Not primarily through malice, though the early Stewie certainly had that component fully operational, primarily through recklessness. Through the specific, unbounded recklessness of a 1-year-old who has access to technology capable of altering the fundamental structure of reality and who operates that technology with the judgment that 1-year-olds reliably bring to every situation. Begin with what the show actually confirmed as canon. In the Season 9 episode titled The Big Bang Theory, which shares its name with the CBS sitcom purely by coincidence, Stewie and Brian get into a petty argument inside Stewie's time machine. Stewie has been using the machine to travel back in time and embarrass Brian repeatedly for comedic effect. Brian discovers this and confronts him. They fight for control of the machine. In the struggle, buttons get pressed and controls get jostled, and the machine goes somewhere it was never designed to go. It transports them outside the space-time continuum entirely, into a void, into non-existence. A space where there is no past and no future and no present and no universe, because the universe has not yet been created and the machine has somehow reached the space that exists before creation began. In this void, the laws of physics do not apply. Stewie's return pad, the device that should be able to bring them back to any point in the timeline, cannot function because it operates on the laws of physics, and there are no laws of physics in the space outside the class. Space-time continuum. The only way back is to create an explosion large enough to propel them back into reality, to overload the return pad's reactor and release enough energy to blow them back into the universe. It is a desperate and genuinely dangerous plan. They execute it. The explosion works. They return home. Sometime after their return, Stewie examines the energy signature produced by the return pad's explosion against the cosmic microwave background radiation, the faint thermal echo that permeates all of space, the residual signature of the event that created the universe, and the signatures match exactly. The energy pattern of Stewie's return pad, overloaded in a void outside time and space, is the Big Bang, the explosion that created the universe. The event from which all of time and space and matter and energy and life and consciousness across 13.8 billion years of cosmic history emerged. It was an accident in Stewie's time machine, caused by a fight about an embarrassing joke. The show presents this as a clever comedic twist, a bit of circular logic played for laughs and then mostly moved past. Brian makes a self-deprecating observation about being the Garfunkel of the universe's creation. Stewie gets a candle from Leonardo da Vinci's workshop as a souvenir. The episode ends. But take this information seriously. Take it with the gravity it deserves as a piece of established canon in the show's universe. And what you have is genuinely staggering. Stewie Griffin is not a character who exists within the universe. Stewie Griffin is the character from whose accident the universe emerged. Every galaxy, every star, every atom of matter that comprises everything that has ever existed or will ever exist. Every human life, every civilization, every moment of joy and suffering across the entire history of time. All of it is there because a baby with a time machine got into an argument with his dog about an embarrassing joke. The closed loop this creates is the stuff of genuine philosophical vertigo. The universe created Stewie so that Stewie could accidentally create the universe, so that the universe could create Stewie. There is no beginning to this sequence and no end. It is a causal loop without origin. Stewie is his own first cause. The answer to the question of why there is something rather than nothing is because he got annoyed. Now zoom out from that specific episode and look at the cumulative record of what Stewie has done with his time travel capabilities across the show's entire run. Because the Big Bang is the largest scale implication of his actions, but it is not the only one. Not by a considerable margin. The Road to the Multiverse episode from Season 8 establishes that Stewie has a device capable of navigating between parallel universes. He and Brian visit over a dozen alternate realities in the course of that single episode. Some of these universes are familiar variations, a universe where Christianity never developed, allowing scientific progress to advance approximately 1,000 years ahead of the primary timeline, creating a civilization dramatically more technologically sophisticated than the one we know. A universe where Japan won World War II, resulting in an America that is part of the Japanese Empire. A universe where dogs are the dominant species and humans are kept as pets. A Flintstones universe. A Disney universe. Each universe visited is populated by versions of people who have real lives, relationships, histories, and futures. Stewie and Brian do not pass through these universes without effect. They interact, they talk to people. In the dog universe, Brian has an extended encounter with a human version of himself who is kept as a pet by dog versions of the Griffin family. A dog universe version of Stewie asks to be taken back to his own universe, and this request sets off a chain of events involving a jailbreak from the dog universe's version of the pound. All of this has consequences for the people in that universe. The dog Stewie, the human Brian, the dog universe versions of everyone they encounter, these people, continue to exist after Stewie and Brian move on. Their lives have been altered by the visit. The ripples do not stop when the travelers step back through the portal. In the Road to Germany episode, Stewie and Brian travel to Nazi Germany accompanied by their neighbor Mort Goldman, the pharmacist from their neighborhood. This episode is established as actual canon within the show's narrative continuity. They travel to obtain uranium needed to power the time machine. During the course of the story, they interact with historical events in ways that create close calls with altering the timeline on a large scale. Stewie impersonates Adolf Hitler to obtain the uranium they need. When they return to the present, there is a version of Mort Goldman who had made the journey, and in order to prevent a causal paradox, Stewie places this version of Mort in the time machine and destroys it. With Mort still inside, Stewie kills Mort Goldman to prevent a paradox. The show presents this as a necessary and comedic detail in a larger adventurous story. But within the logic of the world, a real person died. A version of Mort Goldman, the pharmacist from the neighborhood, was killed by Stewie Griffin, 1 year old, with full awareness of what he was doing, and there were no consequences. The paradox was prevented. The narrative moved on. The Back to the Pilot episode from Season 10 adds another layer of terrible implication. Stewie and Brian travel back to the events of the show's very first episode and observe their past selves. The comedic observation the episode makes is that the past characters stand around blankly during cutaway gags, waiting for them to end. But the episode also involves Stewie interacting with the past timeline in ways that produce multiple branching alternate timelines, including ones that result in nuclear war and the large-scale destruction of civilization in those branches. These branches exist. The people in them continue to live, carrying the consequences of Stewie's interference, and Stewie went home. The cumulative death toll implied by these canonical time travel events, when you take the show's own established logic seriously, is genuinely difficult to calculate but clearly enormous. Every timeline Stewie has branched and left behind is a timeline in which people continue to live with whatever consequences his visit produced. Every alternate universe he has entered and departed has been altered by his presence. Every death he has directly caused represents a real individual within the show's universe whose existence ended because Stewie needed something or wanted something or was simply reacting to something in the moment. The most chilling aspect of the genocide timeline theory is not about the malicious early Stewie, the version who built ray guns and plotted world domination and tried regularly to kill his mother. The malicious early Stewie was at least self-aware about what he was. He knew he was dangerous. He carried the weight of his ambitions with a kind of dark clarity that, while alarming, at least acknowledged the reality of what he was doing. The later Stewie, the warmer, more emotionally complex, more vulnerable version who emerged as the writers moved away from the evil genius characterization, is in some ways more disturbing. He still has the time machine. He still uses it. He still hops between universes with the remote control device, treating the multiverse as a playground to be explored rather than a responsibility to be managed. He does not think of himself as dangerous anymore. He has forgotten, or chosen not to remember, that every universe he enters is real, that every person he interacts with is real, that the ripples he leaves behind do not stop when he steps back through the portal. The most dangerous version of Stewie Griffin is not the one with the ray gun pointed at Lois. It is the one who became sweet and forgot to be careful. Because the sweet Stewie has all the same capabilities as the evil one. He just no longer has the awareness of what those capabilities mean. He is a god who has decided he is just a kid having adventures. And the universes he visits are paying the cost of that decision. Section 6. Brian Griffin's Existential Crisis. Brian Edward Griffin is the most deliberately contradictory character in the Griffin household. He was most specifically designed to represent intelligence and moral clarity in a family that has very little of either the voice of reason, the straight man to Peter's chaos, the resident of 31 Spooner Street who was supposed to provide the counterbalance that made the absurdity of everything else legible. And across the course of the show, he became the character that the audience arguably ended up disliking more than any other, more than Peter at his worst, more than Lois at her coldest. The Quagmire speech from Season 8, in which Quagmire delivers a detailed, specific, and remarkably accurate character indictment of Brian, was not written as a villain's attack. It was written as the audience's accumulated frustration given a voice, as a moment when the show acknowledged what had happened to this character and let someone say it out loud. A Reddit theory that has gained significant traction in the fan community offers an explanation for Brian's decline that is both more charitable and more disturbing than the simple reading of authorial negligence. The theory proposes that Brian's arc across the show's run is an accurate depiction of progressive alcoholism, not a parody or an exaggeration. A realistic, detailed portrait of what alcohol dependency actually does to a person's psychology over time, rendered with more accuracy than the show probably intended to achieve. To understand why this works, you have to know something about how chronic alcohol use actually affects the brain. It is not simply a matter of reduced inhibition or impaired judgment in the immediate term. Long-term heavy alcohol use causes genuine neurological changes that are specific and well documented. It degrades the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control, for accurate self-assessment, for the ability to take in information about one's own behavior and update that behavior accordingly. It affects the structures involved in empathy, making it progressively harder for a person to accurately model what other people are feeling. It produces a characteristic pattern of grandiosity, followed by shame, with the grandiosity becoming more pronounced and the genuine shame becoming less and less accessible as the disease progresses. A person in the middle stages of alcohol dependency will often be convinced that they are more insightful, more intelligent, and more morally sophisticated than the people around them. This is not ordinary vanity. It is a specific symptom of the neurological damage the disease has caused. The machinery that would normally provide accurate feedback about the gap between self-image and actual behavior is exactly the machinery that alcohol degrades first and most completely. In the first 3 seasons of Family Guy, Brian drinks. His martinis are a running character element, part of his identity, mentioned casually, and not framed as a serious problem. He is functional. He is the most articulate and grounded member of the household. His advice to Peter is thoughtful even when Peter ignores it. His moral assessments are occasionally pompous but often correct. He is a person who drinks, in the way that many people who drink are not yet there drinking. By seasons 5 and 6, the political speeches begin arriving with increasing frequency. Brian lectures, he moralizes. He uses conversations about other topics to introduce his views on whatever issue has his attention. This has always been part of his characterization. Brian having opinions is as old as the character, but the ratio shifts. The opinions feel less organic, less earned. They feel inserted rather than grown. By seasons 8 and 9, something has changed substantially in how Brian's self-image relates to his actual behavior. He is performatively intellectual, without the substance to back it up. His novel, when it finally exists, is described in universally negative terms by everyone who reads it. His self-help book, Wish It, Want It, Do It, is a massive bestseller. But it is a bestseller the way that the most vacant cultural products often become bestsellers, through the mechanics of the market rather than the merit of the work. He confuses these things. He thinks the bestseller means his voice matters. He treats Stewie, who believed in him and pushed him to write it, with contempt and dismissiveness in the immediate wake of the success. The Quagmire speech in Jerome is the New Black names what has happened with uncomfortable precision. Quagmire calls Brian a fraud, a pretender, a person who has talked about being a writer for years without actually doing the work of being a writer. A bad father. Brian had a son named Dylan in a previous episode, a son he essentially abandoned, a detail the show let drop without meaningful follow-up. A hypocrite whose stated values and actual behavior are so far apart that the distance between them has become the defining feature of who he is. Everything Quagmire says is supported by events the show has actually depicted. The speech is not exaggeration or cruelty. It is a summary. And Brian's response, he does not change, does not use the information as an opportunity to assess himself seriously, is entirely consistent with the neurological picture of someone in the grip of a disease that has disabled precisely the mechanism that would process that information and translate it into behavioral change. He hears the speech. He continues being the same person. Because the part of the brain that would hear criticism and update accordingly is the part that is no longer fully operational. Then came the death and the resurrection. and what those events reveal when viewed through this lens. In Season 12, Episode 6, Life of Brian. The time machine is destroyed at the start of the episode. Stewie and Brian had agreed it needed to go, to prevent further interference with the timeline. And then, while playing street hockey in the road outside the house, a car comes. Brian does not get out of the way in time. He is struck, he is taken to the vet, he dies on the table. The episode treats this with genuine emotional seriousness. The Griffin family grieves. Stewie is shattered in a way the show allows to be fully felt rather than played for comedic deflection. A new dog named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico, is introduced. He is warm and funny and kind, and the audience is willing to like him while also missing Brian, because that is what grief allows, to acknowledge that someone new can be good while being clear that they are not the same as who you lost. 2 episodes later, in the Christmas episode Christmas Guy, Stewie encounters a past version of himself who still has the time machine, because the past version has not yet made the decision to destroy it. He sends his past self back to the moment of Brian's accident, with instructions to push Brian out of the way of the car. Brian lives. The timeline is restored. Vinny never exists. Through the lens of the alcoholism theory, there is a particular horror to the resurrection. Brian died. Really died. And coming close to death, or in this case, experiencing actual death and then being returned from it, tends to produce perspective shifts, reflection, some reassessment of priorities, some fundamental reevaluation of the life that has been lived up to that moment. Brian came back, and nothing changed. He returned to being exactly who he had been before the car hit him. The grandiosity, the hypocrisy, the specific blindness to his own failings that is the signature symptom of the disease, all of it came back with him. He did not emerge with clarity. He came back and poured himself a martini and continued being Brian. Which is, in the context of the alcoholism theory, exactly right. Because the disease does not pause when something dramatic happens to its host, it does not recognize the significance of significant events. It does not step back and say that this seems like a moment for reflection. It continues. Brian came back from the dead and kept drinking, because the disease was still there. And the disease does not care what just happened. The CIA experiment theory adds a different and equally disturbing layer to Brian's situation. A theory that has been in the fan community for some years proposes that Brian is not a naturally occurring talking dog, but the product of genetic experimentation, likely connected to the CIA operations that are established canon in the shared universe. Family Guy occupies with American Dad. In that shared universe, the CIA has access to technology that allows them to place human consciousness into non-human forms. This is established as a real capability within that universe. And the theory holds that Brian, whose intelligence, verbal sophistication, and human-level emotional complexity are all significantly beyond what any naturally occurring dog possesses, was created. Not born into these capabilities, but engineered to possess them. If Brian was designed, then his existential sadness takes on a specific and terrible quality. He is a person who was made for a purpose he was never told. He has human desires for love, for recognition, for literary achievement, for connection that were built into him as part of the design. But the design also made him a dog. It gave him the inner life of a human and the body of an animal, and then deployed him in a domestic setting where those two things would be in permanent, irresolvable tension. His reaching toward the world of human accomplishment and recognition is not the pretension the quagmire speech diagnoses. It is the built-in imperative of a designed being trying to fulfill its design in the only context available to it. And the disease, the alcoholism that the other theory maps onto his arc, makes sense in this context as well. A designed being, placed in a context that cannot satisfy its design, that cannot give it what it was built to need, would reach for something that provides the neurochemical compensation for that deprivation. It would reach for something that temporarily closes the gap between the life it is supposed to have and the life it is actually living. Alcohol is very good at temporarily closing gaps, and it is very good at making those gaps permanent in the long run. Brian came back from the dead and kept drinking. And the theory holds that the drinking is why he came back and nothing changed. Because the thing that would have needed to change the disease, the mechanism, the specific shape of the damage, is the thing the death did not interrupt. The death ended, and the disease continued. It was always the stronger force. Section 7, Lois Griffin's Hidden Identity. The show presents Lois Schmidt Griffin as the reasonable center of the household, the patient wife, the devoted mother, the long-suffering straight woman who rolls her eyes at Peter's antics with a mixture of affection and exhaustion, and manages the Griffin family's chaos with weary, practical grace. This is the official Lois. The one the show invites you to sympathize with. The one who seems, on the surface of things, like the most uncomplicated figure in the family. But spend enough time looking at the actual record of what Lois does across the show's run, not what the show says she is, but what she actually does. The choices she makes, the capabilities she demonstrates, the places where her behavior does not match the image she projects, and a different picture assembles itself. One that is more complex, significantly darker, and in some ways harder to look at directly than anything the show has been willing to say about its other characters. Begin with the family she came from. Lois Patrice Schmidt was born into one of the wealthiest families in Rhode Island. Her father, Carter Schmidt, is a man of formidable intelligence and documented amorality who built his fortune through methods the show has been willing to describe in detail. One extended storyline reveals that Carter gave an entire town cancer through chemical waste disposal and then refused to make the cure public because doing so would have been financially inconvenient. He covered it up. He let people die from cancer he caused because treating them would have cost him money. This is Lois's father. This is the man who raised her. And her brother, Patrick Schmidt, became a serial killer who targeted overweight men. He is institutionalized. His existence is treated as a dark, comedic background detail, but it means that Lois grew up in a family with a serial killer sibling and a father who committed acts that would constitute serious crimes if they ever came fully to light. The family she came from does not produce gentle, patient, quietly suffering housewives as its natural output. It produces people of considerable intelligence and equally considerable capacity for harm who channel those qualities in the direction of their ambition. Carter channeled his into business. Patrick channeled his into violence. What did Lois channel hers into? The official answer is the household. The patient management of a chaotic family. The daily work of keeping everything from completely falling apart. But there is another answer, one the show has documented in fragments across its run, that sits underneath the patient housewife image. Lois became a black belt in taijutsu. This is established as a real and substantial capability. She deploys it in the show with convincing force when the situation calls for it. People who achieve black belt status have spent years developing a specific form of dangerous competence. They made a choice to do that. Lois made that choice. It sits oddly with the patient housewife image, and it sits there for a reason. She developed kleptomania. In breaking out is hard to do, she becomes addicted to shoplifting, stealing things she does not need and could easily afford. The behavioral profile of kleptomania in the clinical literature is specific. It is not primarily about the object stolen, but about the act of stealing itself, about the specific combination of tension and release and private control that the act produces. It is a disorder that tends to emerge when ordinary life does not provide adequate access to feelings of power and agency. Lois steals because the housewife existence, the patient center of the family, the manager of other people's chaos, is not sufficient. It does not give her what she needs. The theory that has assembled itself from these fragments proposes the following. Lois did not choose Peter by accident. She did not stumble into a relationship with an unremarkable brewery employee because she was naively romantic or unaware of her alternatives. She chose Peter specifically, with awareness of what he was and what he could and could not provide, because a man of Peter's particular limitations was what she needed for reasons that were specific and calculated. Carter Schmidt disapproved of Peter strongly and consistently, and the show presents this as the disapproving patriarch resisting his daughter's authentic romantic choice. But the theory reads it differently. Carter could see what Lois was doing. He could see she was not choosing Peter despite his limitations, but because of them. Because a man who cannot function at her level cannot challenge her authority, cannot see her clearly enough to hold her accountable, cannot ultimately threaten her position of dominance in the relationship. Lois needed to be the most capable person in her own household. In the Schmidt world, she would have been one of several capable people in a competitive environment where her specific qualities might not have guaranteed the dominance she needed. With Peter, she is the only capable adult. The household depends entirely on her management. The chaos of Peter's decisions creates an ongoing demand for her competence that guarantees her central position in perpetuity. She chose someone who would need her, permanently and completely, because being needed on those terms gave her something that nothing else in her life had provided. This reading transforms every episode where Lois is framed as the long-suffering patient wife. She is not suffering in the way a person suffers when they are trapped somewhere they did not choose. She is managing a situation she designed. The chaos is the point. Peter's incompetence is not the obstacle to Lois's happiness. It is the architecture of it. The treatment of Meg in this reading sharpens the theory into something genuinely disturbing. If Lois chose her domestic arrangement because it gives her control, because it guarantees her centrality and her indispensability, then Meg's desire for real maternal warmth and validation is a direct challenge to the equilibrium Lois has constructed. A daughter who needs genuine emotional engagement, who asks to be seen, who asks for the kind of present attentiveness that real maternal care involves, requires Lois to be something different from the competent manager she has made herself into. It requires vulnerability, connection, a kind of reciprocity that Lois's arrangement with Peter does not require of her. It is easier, emotionally safer, more consistent with the architecture she has built to let Meg go unacknowledged, to allow the family dynamic of cruelty and invisibility to continue without intervention, rather than doing the harder work of genuinely showing up for the daughter who needs her. The choice to let Meg suffer is not cruelty in the way Peter's behavior is cruelty. It is a more quiet failure of will, a refusal to let Meg's need interrupt the arrangement that Lois has chosen, and in which she is, in her specific way, comfortable. The Pewter-Schmidt genetic legacy adds a final note that threads all of this together. If Carter's darkness went into amoral business and Patrick's went into serial violence, and Lois channeled her capacity for harm into the household, then Meg, who is the most vulnerable member of the household, and the one with the least ability to leave or resist, is the one who bears the most of what Lois's nature produces, when it has nowhere more appropriate to go. Not because Lois consciously targets Meg, but because the household is where Lois's control operates, and Meg is the part of the household that provides the least resistance to that control. The patient housewife is the cover story. Underneath it is something that has been running this household and this family and this specific arrangement with careful and continuous attention for over 25 years. Something that chose this life deliberately and that has never entirely regretted the choice. Section 8. Quagmire's secret life and the town's complicity. Glenn Quagmire, as a comedic figure, functions through the mechanism of the joke that transgresses and then moves on before the transgression can be fully assessed. He says something outrageous. The laugh track responds. The conversation moves forward. The audience has laughed before it has had time to think about what exactly it is laughing at. This is a deliberate technique, deployed around Quagmire since his introduction, and it works in the moment because the transgression is framed as absurdism rather than as anything warranting sustained attention. But the fan theory community has been paying sustained attention, and what it has found, looking at Quagmire without the protective buffer of the comedic frame, is a character who is among the most disturbing figures in the show when examined closely. The incubus theory begins with the facts the show itself has established. Quagmire does not age normally. He is, according to the show's stated timeline, past 60 years old in the present-day episodes. He looks considerably younger than that. The age gap between his stated age and his apparent vitality is acknowledged in the show and presented as a mystery treated as a joke. 60-plus years old, with vitality and appetite showing no signs of diminishment. He has had sexual encounters with an extraordinary number of partners across the show's run, a number the show itself has occasionally attempted to quantify and has generally presented as beyond ordinary human experience. He has contracted sexually transmitted diseases from these encounters. The show acknowledges this explicitly, but he is not diminished by them, not made sick. In one episode, he weaponizes them. The diseases that would disable or significantly harm a normal person are, for Quagmire, just another resource available to him. An incubus, in the mythology of multiple traditions, is a supernatural entity that subsists on the energy of sexual encounters. It is not subject to normal human aging. It cannot contract the diseases that affect its partners in the way those partners are affected. It exists in a state of permanent hunger that cannot be satisfied because the hunger is not a need to be met but an engine to be maintained. The hunger is the point. The comedic cutaway that depicted Quagmire killing Homer Simpson and his entire family is, in the incubus reading, not a throwaway gag. It is a revelation about what Quagmire is capable of when cornered. Homer catches Quagmire in a compromising situation with Marge. And Quagmire's response is immediate and total. He kills Homer, kills Marge, and when the Simpson children come in and witness the scene, 3 additional gunshots are heard. He kills them all. He eliminates every witness with no visible emotion, no hesitation, no moral friction. This is not a person who did a bad thing in a moment of panic. This is an entity that eliminated an obstacle, efficiently and completely, with the same indifference to the outcome that you would bring to solving a logistics problem. It is presented as a joke. It lands as a joke. But the information it deposits is real within the show's mythology. The Cleveland Jr. dimension of the Quagmire theory adds another disturbing layer. Loretta Brown, Cleveland's first wife, had an affair with Quagmire. This is established, canonical, and the event from which the Cleveland and Loretta divorce originated. Cleveland Jr., Cleveland's son, underwent a significant physical redesign when The Cleveland Show was produced. He became rounder and softer, with a specific hairstyle and glasses, and the result was a character who looked significantly more like Peter Griffin than like Cleveland Brown. Given Loretta's established infidelity with Quagmire, the question of Cleveland Jr.'s actual parentage is genuinely unresolved by the show's own established facts. The theory leaves this unresolved for a reason. Some questions are more interesting open than closed. The broader theory extends outward to the town's relationship with Quagmire. The town of Quahog has a population of 800, according to one episode. Everyone knows everyone. The neighbors know what Quagmire is. Peter knows. Joe, as a police officer, should know. And nothing ever happens. Nobody intervenes. Nobody initiates any process of accountability. The community has developed, through the accumulated inertia of looking away, a collective agreement to absorb what Quagmire is without making it into something that would require action. The Drunken Clam, the bar where the social fabric of the neighborhood is maintained week after week, where Peter and his friends gather to perform their ritual of masculine friendship, is the most visible institution of this complicity. It is the place where the community comes together and reinforces, through the warmth of social belonging that the bar provides, the agreement not to address certain things. The incubus is welcomed at that table, and the table continues its ritual, while the darkness it contains goes unnamed and unaddressed. Quagmire is not just a morally troubling character. He is the revelation of what a community does when it decides that some things are better left unexamined. He is the test case for the limits of the social agreement that holds Spooner Street together. And the answer the show provides, across 25 years of not holding him accountable, is that those limits are very far from where you would hope them to be. The community does not just fail to stop what Quagmire is. The community actively preserves the conditions that allow him to continue. Section 9. The cutaway dimension is real. The cutaway gag is Family Guy's most distinctive structural feature. The thing that makes it recognizably itself, that no other animated comedy has fully replicated, that has generated more viral content and more cultural shorthand than any other element of the show. A character says something, the screen cuts to an unrelated scene, the scene plays out for several seconds, and then the show returns to its original scene as if nothing happened. The show's own internal mythology has been moving in a specific direction on this question for years. In the episode Cutaway Land from the later seasons, Peter and Lois discover that they can physically travel between cutaways. They enter one cutaway and find themselves in a real physical location, a place with geography and rules, a place where the events of previous cutaway gags are apparently still occurring or have left evidence of their having occurred. They move between cutaways the way you would move between rooms in a building or stations on a train line. This is the show canonizing something that fan theorists had been arguing for years. The cutaways are not interruptions to the show's reality. They are adjacent realities. They exist in a dimension that is accessible from the show's primary reality under the right conditions, and they contain real events involving real people who continue to exist inside those cutaways, regardless of whether the show has its camera pointed at them. Inside Family Guy, an illustrated history, the companion book to the series, describes certain categories of cutaway as existing in what it calls an even more beyond state, a world and characters removed from the town's geography, historical or otherwise. This is the show's official publication acknowledging, in fairly precise language, that the space in which cutaways happen is genuinely separate from and beyond the primary narrative reality of the show. Think carefully about what this means for the content of 25 seasons of cutaways. Every historical figure the show has placed into a cutaway scenario has lived a version of those events in the cutaway dimension. George Washington has done whatever Family Guy depicted George Washington doing. Every moment of harm depicted in cutaway form, every physical injury, every humiliation, every death happened to a real person in a real place. The joke lands in the primary reality of the show and dissipates after a few seconds. The event it depicts continues to exist in the cutaway dimension, carrying whatever consequences it carries. The person who was depicted being hurt is still experiencing the aftermath. The person who was depicted dying is dead in that dimension. The comedy is at their expense, and they are still there. The mechanism of the cutaway adds another disturbing element to this picture. A character says something, makes a comparison, invokes a memory, and the screen cuts. The people in the cutaway dimension do not initiate this. They do not request to be seen. The transition is triggered from the primary reality by an act of speech. When Peter Griffin opens his mouth to make a comparison, people in the cutaway dimension are briefly exposed, unwillingly and without warning, to the attention of an entity from another dimension. They are viewed, assessed, displayed, and then the attention passes and they return to whatever they were doing, carrying the experience of having been observed without consent. The contaminated water theory offers an alternative explanation that does not require a separate dimension. Season 5 established as canon that the lake near the town is severely polluted. The theory proposes that the specific chemicals in this contaminated water supply have been causing neurological effects in the town's residents over years of exposure effects that manifest as shared hallucinatory episodes. When a character says something that triggers a cutaway, what is actually happening is a synchronized neurological event in everyone present, during which all of them experience the same vivid, detailed hallucinations simultaneously. The cutaway is not a portal. It is a collective neurochemical episode. This version explains the communal quality of cutaways. They seem accessible to everyone in a scene when one person triggers one without requiring an adjacent dimension. It also explains their increasing frequency and duration as the show progresses. The contamination accumulates, the neurological effects deepen, the hallucinatory episodes become longer and harder to distinguish from ordinary experience. The character changes observable across the show's run track loosely, with the kinds of behavioral and personality changes that long-term neurological damage from chemical contamination can produce in affected populations. Both theories are mutually exclusive as literal explanations, but both reveal something true about the show's relationship to consequence. Family Guy deploys its most characteristic feature in a way deliberately designed to prevent consequence from attaching to what is depicted. The gag plays and is gone. The damage, if any, disappears with it. The theories about cutaway realities are the fan community's insistence that this framing is insufficient. That what is depicted, even in the most deliberately disposable format the show employs, is real enough to matter. That comedy is not a neutral container, and that the accumulated record of 25 seasons of Family Guy cutaway gags is, among other things, a document of what its audience was willing to laugh at and move past without looking directly at. Section 10. Cleveland's Departure and the Curse. Cleveland Brown left Spooner Street, and the street got darker after he left. This is the core observation from which the curse theory proceeds, and it is worth establishing that the observation is not merely interpretive. The show's treatment of its characters, the tone of its humor, the frequency and severity of its cruelty, the graphic quality of its violence, these metrics all moved in a specific and documentable direction after Cleveland's departure for Virginia and the launch of The Cleveland Show in 2009. The characters became more extreme, the humor became more aggressive, the warmth that had survived the revival seasons thinned further and faster. Cleveland Brown in the early seasons of Family Guy serves a specific structural function in the social ecosystem of Spooner Street. He is the most emotionally measured of Peter's three friends. While Quagmire escalates and Joe occasionally enables, Cleveland counsels patience. He is the one most likely to look at what Peter is doing and register, without drama and without cruelty, that the situation has gone a bit too far. He absorbs the momentum of the group's worst impulses and redirects it. He is a stabilizing element in a system that requires stabilization to avoid complete chaos. When he leaves, that function disappears. Joe cannot fill it because Joe's own arc has been moving toward degradation. His disability has increasingly become a comedic target, his moral authority steadily eroded by the show's treatment of him. Quagmire cannot fill it at all. Peter without Cleveland is Peter with no counterweight, no friction, no one to mark the moment when things have genuinely gone too far. And the show, without that friction, became something more extreme. The curse reading gives this dynamic a specific shape rooted in the town's own founding mythology. The show established in Season 7's Peter's Progress that the Griffin family has a peculiar and specific connection to the founding of Quahog. Peter's ancestor, Griffin Peterson, founded the town under circumstances involving considerable deception and the suffering of people close to him. The town's history begins in the specific moral failures of a griffin. And in the curse reading, that origin has consequences that continue to operate in the present. The Griffin family and the town are connected in a way that is active and ongoing. The health of the one reflects and affects the health of the other. When the social structure around the Griffins is balanced, when there are enough stabilizing elements in the neighborhood to prevent the worst of the Griffin tendencies from running unchecked, the connection between the Griffin family and the town's ambient darkness stays manageable. The chaos exists but within limits. When the stabilizing elements are removed, the darkness that was always latent in both the family and the town becomes dominant. Cleveland's departure was the removal of a stabilizing element, and it was caused, specifically, by Quagmire's affair with Loretta, by the character the theory identifies as the most unchecked and potentially supernatural source of harm on Spooner Street. The incubus drove out the counterweight. And in the aftermath of that, the darkness the incubus embodies became less contained. The Cleveland show ran from 2009 to 2013, 4 seasons in Stoolbend, Virginia, before cancellation. Cleveland then returned to Family Guy as a recurring presence. But the theory holds that the years of absence had done structural damage that could not be fully repaired by his return. A system that has been running without a critical component for 4 years does not simply return to its previous configuration when the component is reintroduced. The patterns established during the absence persist. The habits formed during Cleveland's time away, the habits of cruelty, of escalation without counterweight, of humor that had stopped registering when it had gone too far, those habits were baked in by the time he came back. The needle had moved. And in this particular universe, needles do not move back of their own accord. The curse is not lifted by Cleveland's return. The curse is a property of the history of the place, and histories accumulate rather than erase. The darkness that became dominant during the years of absence is still there, still operative, even when the stabilizing element has been restored. The street is different from what it was before. The house is the same, but the neighborhood around it has shifted, in some way that is difficult to name but impossible to miss, towards something less balanced and less safe. Section 11. The writers are characters. Family Guy has broken the fourth wall more times than any reasonable count would be practical to compile. Characters have acknowledged they are on a Fox television show. Peter has made jokes about the writing room. In one episode, the characters literally travel back to the pilot and observe their past selves. In another, the show creates a meta-episode in which the characters comment on the episode as it unfolds. The self-referentiality of Family Guy is one of its characteristic features, deployed so frequently and so casually that it has become part of the visual and comedic language of the show itself. The theory that takes this seriously, not as a comedic technique but as a feature of the world the characters actually inhabit, proposes something that is either philosophically fascinating or genuinely horrifying, depending on your perspective and your tolerance for implications. What if the characters know? Not in the winking, performative sense that fourth wall breaks typically imply the comedian stepping out of the bit to acknowledge they are doing a bit, then stepping back in, but actually, genuinely, with full consciousness and without recourse to any protective irony. What if Peter Griffin and Brian and Stewie and Lois and Meg are fully aware that they are fictional characters in an animated television show, that their world is a construction, that their suffering and their joy and their deaths and their resurrections are all managed by a writing room in Los Angeles that decides what happens to them each week? The evidence is distributed through the show in moments that are individually explainable as comedic choices, but that accumulate into a pattern when taken together. The Back to the Pilot episode from Season 10 contains a specific detail the theory hangs significant weight on. Stewie and Brian travel back to the events of the first episode. While in the past, they observe their past selves participating in that original episode. The comedic observation the episode makes is that the past versions of the characters stand around during cutaway gags with nothing to do. They are present in the scene, but the cutaway has displaced their activity, and they simply wait for it to end so they can continue. They are aware that something has happened. They are aware they have no agency over it. They are waiting for an external force to return the scene to them. This is a specific and precise observation. The characters in the past know they are inside a cutaway. They do not know what the cutaway contains, but they know that the normal flow of the scene has been interrupted by something they cannot control. They are aware of the mechanism that organizes their world. They are not free within it. This is not played as a horror, but when you read it as information rather than comedy, it functions as one. The Conway-Twitty gag the bit where the show, multiple times across several seasons, would simply broadcast an unedited Conway-Twitty performance for several minutes with no punchline and no context is almost universally cited as evidence of lazy writing. And in the production context, that is exactly what it was. Writers with insufficient material filling time with something else. But in the theory of characters who are aware of their situation, the Conway-Twitty moments read differently. They are the characters declining to perform. A scene ends, the next scene should begin. Instead of a scene, there is music. The characters are absent. The show, which must fill the time but cannot acknowledge that the characters have exercised some form of agency over their own participation, replaces them with something else while waiting for them to return. The existential weight of this theory falls heaviest on Stewie, because Stewie is canonically the creator of the universe. The explosion that began the Big Bang, the event from which all of time and space and matter and consciousness emerged, it was Stewie's accident. He is the first cause of everything, and yet his stories are written by other people. His arc from evil genius to soft companion to whatever the current season requires of him has been managed and redirected and softened by decisions made in a writing room he had no input into. The creator of the universe cannot control his own narrative. The first cause is subject to causes he did not initiate. His intelligence, which is genuinely extraordinary, which has been demonstrated to exceed that of nearly every other character in the show, is sufficient to understand the situation exactly. He knows what he is. He knows where he is. He knows that the exits are managed by people who are not him. In April of 2025, it was announced that Family Guy had been renewed for additional seasons in a deal with parent company Disney, taking the show through the 2028 to 2029 television season and the show's 30th anniversary. Each season would consist of 15 episodes. The show is not just surviving, it is being guaranteed a future, locked in by formal documents, sealed by business interests that have nothing to do with the creative health of what is being made. The characters are trapped in the loop until at least 2029. The terms of their containment have been extended, in writing, by the people who control their fate. If the characters know and the accumulated evidence of fourth wall breaks and meta-commentary and the specific texture of the show's self-awareness suggests they have at least some awareness, then they also know this. The contract has been renewed. The sentence has been extended. The awareness of that extension is something they carry, visibly, in the way the show continues to make jokes about its own declining quality and its own continued existence, despite that declining quality. Characters who were aware of their situation would make exactly those jokes. It is the only response available within the format that contains them. The jokes are not deflection. The jokes are testimony, delivered in the only language the format permits. Section 12. What the show is really about. Here is the synthesis. Here is the place where the specific theories we have walked through begin to point towards something that sits beneath all of them. A single underlying recognition that explains not just the disturbing fan theories about Family Guy, but why those theories feel true in a way that fan theories about other shows usually do not. Family Guy is a show about the impossibility of escaping the self. Not about family, though family is the medium through which the show works. Not about American suburbia, though that is the setting. Not about satire or political commentary or the dark possibilities of animated comedy, though it draws on all of these things throughout its long run. Underneath all of it, Family Guy is a sustained 25-year investigation of the specific horror of being trapped inside one's own nature, of knowing, with total clarity, who you are and what you are doing and doing it anyway, of having every resource necessary for change and still remaining exactly who you were before those resources arrived. Peter cannot stop being Peter. His recklessness, his willful avoidance of consequence, his preference for comfort over accountability, these are not imposed on him from outside. They are choices he makes in every episode, across every season. The show has given him more opportunities for genuine growth than most real people receive in a lifetime. He has been confronted with his failures in terms that are specific and devastating and perfectly clear. He has sat in the moment of recognition, the moment that should produce change, that in a more conventional story would produce change, and he has walked out of that moment the same person who walked in. The needle does not move because he does not want it to move. The change would cost something, and the cost is not one he is willing to pay. Brian cannot stop being Brian. His pretensions are not an accident of character but a choice, a decision to prioritize the image of sophistication over the substantially harder work of becoming sophisticated. The alcoholism theory is right about the mechanism, but the mechanism is only the physical expression of something that was already there, already chosen. He chose the image over the substance, and having made that choice, he reinforced it every time it would have been easier to look at himself honestly and declined to do so. He hears the quagmire speech. He continues, because the part of the brain that would hear criticism and change is the part that is no longer fully operational. But underneath the neurological damage is the original choice, still standing, still the load-bearing wall. Stewie cannot escape the paradox of his own existence, the temporal causality loop that places him as the creator of the universe, that makes him his own ancestor, that gives him extraordinary power over time and space, and simultaneously locks him into a situation from which none of that power can free him. He is 1 year old. He cannot leave the house. He cannot prevent the people around him from being managed by people other than himself, and he cannot prevent his own story from being managed the same way. His intelligence is the clearest possible instrument for understanding exactly how trapped he is, and it gives him nothing in terms of resources for getting free. The most capable mind in the household is the most precisely confined. Meg cannot stop wanting to be loved. This is not a flaw in the ordinary sense. It is the most basic human condition, the desire that underlies virtually everything else. But in a family constitutionally unable to provide what she needs, the desire keeps being denied. And the show's most terrible observation is the one it delivers repeatedly and without apparent awareness of how terrible it is. That Meg keeps showing up anyway, keeps being there, keeps participating in the family that hurts her because the family, however broken, is what she has. The need for love is more durable than the damage done to it. This is the most human observation the show makes, and it delivers it as a punchline, season after season, because the show has decided that the most human thing about Meg is also the funniest thing about Meg. And in that decision, the show reveals more about itself than any fan theory has managed to. Lois cannot stop being her father's daughter. The Pewter-Schmidt nature went into the household and it runs there, quietly and continuously, beneath the surface of the patient housewife image. The capacity for control, for management, for the cold, pragmatic assessment of situations that built that family's fortune, it did not leave when she chose Peter. It found a different scale to operate at. And at the scale of the household, in the specific context she has constructed, it is invisible in the way that ordinary power, exercised in ordinary domestic spaces, is always invisible. She chose this life deliberately. She runs it deliberately. And the distance between the image she presents and the thing she actually is represents one of the show's most carefully maintained silences. These 5 characters, running their patterns endlessly in the yellow house on Spooner Street, are the show's argument that people are more themselves than they are anything else. That the desire for change, however sincere in the moment it is felt, is almost never sufficient to produce change when change would require sustained, costly, often unrewarding work over time. That the gravitational pull of the self is the strongest force most people ever encounter, stronger than love, stronger than consequence, stronger than the most devastating and clearly delivered evidence that the current path is producing harm. This is a dark argument. It is also, if you have spent any time observing actual human beings across the actual passage of time, a recognizable one. The fan theories that have attached themselves to Family Guy are the fan community's attempt to make sense of why the show feels the way it does, why a cartoon about a goofy family leaves certain viewers with something that does not entirely dissipate when the episode ends. The purgatory theory, the insane Peter theory, the Meg as only real person theory, the Stewie as creator of everything theory, each of these is a different way of asking the same question. Why does this show keep going the way it goes? Why does nothing ever change? Why does the same damage keep being inflicted, and the same lessons keep being failed to learn, and the same yellow house keep standing on the same street with the same people inside it, cycling through the same patterns decade after decade? And the answer that the show has been constructing across 25 years, the answer that the fan theories are all pointing toward from their different angles, is this: because that is what people do. That is the truth the show is telling, in the loudest and most deliberately absurdist voice available to it. People stay themselves. People cycle. People are given everything they need to change, and they do not change. Not because they cannot, but because the self is the strongest prison there is, and it is also the only home most people have ever known. The show goes on through 2029. The sentence has been renewed. The machine keeps turning. The Griffin family wakes up every week in the yellow house on Spooner Street, performs the episode that has been written for them, and returns to the baseline position from which the next episode will begin. And Stewie is still 1 year old. He was 1 year old in 1999 when the pilot aired. He was 1 year old in 2025 when season 24 premiered. He will be 1 year old in 2029 when the current renewal period expires, if it expires then. Sitting in his crib, building his time machine, looking out the window at Spooner Street below, where the same cars are parked in the same spots, and the same neighbors are moving through routines they have been moving through for over a quarter century. He could go anywhere. He has the technology. He has gone anywhere across the multiverse, across time, into the void outside space-time itself. He made the universe. He made everything. Every star and every atom and every moment of consciousness that has ever existed is there because of something that happened in his bedroom. And he comes back to 31 Spooner Street. Every time. Because that is where he lives. Because that is home. Because whatever you think about what home means in this context, the purgatory reading, the prison reading, the self as prison reading that underlies all of them, the pull of it is real. The characters return because they are inside the same gravitational force that keeps all of us inside the patterns we know we should leave. Not because the force is supernatural, because it is the self. Because the self always finds its way back to what it knows. The show ends when it ends. The house stays, the family stays inside it. The machine keeps running. There it is, every theory, every thread, every quiet wrongness buried in a cartoon that has been on your television for over a quarter century. If any of these have stayed with you, if you find yourself thinking about Peter in his armchair, or Meg in the doorway, or Stewie in his crib with slightly different questions than you had before, then this was worth making. Drop a comment below. Tell me which theory hit you the hardest. Tell me which one you refuse to accept. Tell me if there is a theory we did not cover that you think deserves the spotlight. Because this particular rabbit hole does not have a visible bottom, and I am always looking for new ways into it. If this is the kind of thing you would come back to, and I genuinely hope it is, a subscription costs nothing and means more than I can properly express. We put real time and real thought into everything we make here. Knowing the community is growing is what makes it worth doing. Section 13. The chicken fight as confession. Of all the recurring elements in Family Guy, the cutaway gags, the Conway Twitty interruptions, the road to episodes, the musical numbers, none has generated quite as much sustained theorizing as the ongoing battle between Peter Griffin and Ernie the Giant Chicken. If you have seen even a handful of episodes of Family Guy, you know what this is. Peter encounters a man-sized chicken named Ernie at some point in an episode. A fight breaks out, and what follows is an extended, elaborately choreographed, cinematically shot sequence of two beings trying to destroy each other with everything available to them. Buildings collapse, cars explode, they fight through warehouses and across rooftops, and through the wind. They are exhausting and spectacular and completely disconnected from whatever the episode was actually about. And then, usually, the fight ends with no resolution. Peter walks away. The chicken walks away. And the show continues as if nothing happened. The fan community has spent considerable energy trying to figure out what the chicken is. Not in the narrative sense, the show provides an origin, a bad coupon that Ernie gave Peter once that turned out to be expired, which sparked the feud in the first place, but in the symbolic sense. Because the chicken fights are too elaborate, too visually invested, too cinematically distinct from the rest of the show's aesthetic to be just a running gag, they are something. The question is what? The most compelling theory frames the chicken fights as Peter's subconscious made visible. In this reading, Ernie the Giant Chicken is not an external antagonist. He is an externalization of something internal, a projection of Peter's own guilt, his own unprocessed anger, his own inability to reckon with who he is and what he has done. Every time the chicken appears, it is not because of some narrative reason. It is because something in Peter's psyche has surfaced and is demanding to be addressed. And because Peter cannot address it directly because the mechanism of his constructed fantasy does not allow for that kind of directness, the confrontation takes the form of something physical, spectacular, and ultimately unresolved. Think about the structure of every chicken fight. Peter and Ernie meet. Violence breaks out almost immediately, without significant discussion or negotiation. The fight escalates beyond any reasonable proportion to its cause. And then it ends without resolution, not with one of them defeated, not with the grievance addressed, not with any kind of reckoning. They simply stop, separate, and life continues. The core conflict is never resolved. The fight happens and then happens again, in a future episode, as if it never happened at all. This is also, precisely, the structure of Peter's relationship with his own conscience. Something wrong is done. The wrongness produces a response: anxiety, guilt, the pressure of unacknowledged harm. The pressure cannot be processed directly because the system is not designed to process it directly. So it takes an indirect form, something external and physical and apparently unrelated to the actual source of the feeling. The fight happens. It is spectacular and consuming and exhausting. And then it ends without resolving the underlying thing, which means the underlying thing will surface again eventually, wearing the face of a giant chicken. The expired coupon that started the feud is a detail worth sitting with. Peter is furious at the chicken for giving him a coupon that did not work. This is, objectively, a trivial grievance. People receive expired coupons all the time without waging multi-episode wars that level sections of city infrastructure. The triviality of the initial cause is the point, because in the symbolic reading the coupon is not really the issue. The coupon is the surface reason that the psyche attaches to a confrontation that has a much deeper cause. It is the thing Peter tells himself the fight is about, because the thing the fight is actually about is not something he can name or look at directly. Ernie the giant chicken is, in this reading, everything Peter cannot confront, everything he has done and not acknowledged, every harm caused without consequence, every person hurt without reckoning, every moment where he should have stopped and didn't and then kept going anyway. The chicken is the bill that keeps coming due. The fights never resolve because the bill is never actually paid. Peter walks away each time, battered and exhausted and apparently fine. And the chicken walks away too. And somewhere in the city behind them, another building is on fire, and the next episode begins as though none of it happened. The most poignant version of this theory involves the episodes where Peter and Ernie briefly reconcile. There have been moments in the show's run where Peter and the chicken share a meal, or help each other out of a difficult situation, or have an encounter that seems to suggest the feud might actually be over. And then it starts again. The reconciliation does not hold. The violence returns. Because whatever the chicken represents, whatever the fight is actually about reconciliation with it, is not something the loop allows. The loop resets everything, including the possibility of peace. Section 14. Stewie's weapons and what they mean. In the first 3 seasons of Family Guy, Stewie Griffin's bedroom was an armory. Not metaphorically, literally. He had a mind control device. He had a weather-altering machine. He had laser guns of various sizes and capabilities. He had a shrink ray. He had a growth ray. He had a time machine in various early configurations. He had a device that could alter the fundamental nature of matter. He had things that the show did not fully explain but that clearly operated at a level of technological sophistication that should not exist anywhere in the world, let alone in the bedroom of an infant in Rhode Island. Where did any of it come from? The show never answers this, and the fan community has spent years trying to do what the show declined to do. The most interesting answer is not about the weapons themselves, but about what their existence implies about the nature of the world Stewie inhabits. One school of thought holds that Stewie's weapons are real, that they actually exist in the physical world of the show, constructed by Stewie from materials he obtained through means the show has not fully depicted. In this reading, Stewie is simply a genuine prodigy of impossible ability, a 1-year-old who is, for reasons the show does not explain and does not try to, operating at a level of scientific understanding that should require decades of advanced education to even approach. He is a genius. The weapons are evidence of the genius. The explanation stops there. But there is a more disturbing reading. What if Stewie's weapons are real, not in the physical world of the show, but in the specific sense that matters for the purgatory or constructed reality theories we walked through earlier? What if Stewie's weapons are real precisely because the world is constructed to accommodate them, because the world is not bound by the physics of actual reality but by the internal logic of whatever consciousness is generating it. In the insane Peter theory, Stewie is Peter's imagined version of the child he never got to meet. Peter fills the space of that child with everything he hoped the child could be, and in a man's fantasy, an extraordinary child might well have extraordinary abilities. The weapons are not real in the sense of existing in the physical world. They are real in the sense that the fantasy requires them to be. Peter imagines his son as capable of anything. The weapons are the visual representation of that imagined capability. In the Meg generates reality theory, Stewie is Meg's internal voice, her fantasized avatar of power and revenge. The weapons are the weapons Meg imagines herself having, the tools of the counterattack she has never been able to mount in the actual relationships of her actual life. The laser gun pointed at Lois is Meg's imagined response to every time Lois has failed to show up for her, scaled up to the level of science fiction and placed in the hands of a baby because that is how the psyche sometimes works, giving its fantasies the most extreme possible form precisely because they are fantasies and will never be enacted. There is a third reading that does not require the constructed reality framework. What if Stewie's weapons are evidence of a truth about the Family Guy universe that the show has never quite stated plainly? That the technology level of the world in which these characters live is significantly higher than the show usually acknowledges. The show is set in what appears to be contemporary America, but Stewie has time travel in his bedroom. The CIA in the show's shared universe has technology for consciousness transfer. There are aliens. There is multiversal travel. What if the apparently normal suburban setting of Family Guy is not actually normal? What if it is a place where technologies of this kind exist, are known to exist, and are simply not discussed openly? What if Stewie's weapons are not evidence of his prodigious genius, but evidence of a world where this technology is more available than anyone is letting on? This reading changes what Stewie's abandonment of his evil genius characterization means. If the technology is available to anyone who knows where to look, if the weapons are not exclusive to Stewie, but simply things he was the first to access, then the later Stewies move away from his armory and toward emotional complexity is not just a character evolution. It is a choice not to use the tools that are available to him. It is restraint. The baby who could still build the laser gun and the mind control device, who still knows how to construct anything he built before, who still has access to whatever sources and materials produced those things in the first place, that baby has decided, for reasons of his own, to put the weapons down. And whatever those reasons are, they have not been fully explained. The weapons are in the closet somewhere. Stewie knows it, and the show keeps moving forward without quite addressing what that means. Section 15. The loop and the laugh track. There is a sound that accompanies almost every joke in Family Guy that is worth spending some time with, not because it is mysterious, but because of what it does when you analyze its function in the context of the theories we have been discussing. That sound is the laugh track, the recorded studio audience response, the wave of laughter that follows each joke, that validates each moment of humor, that tells the viewer at home how to feel about what they have just seen. Laugh tracks are a convention of the sitcom format so deeply embedded that most viewers process them without conscious awareness. They function as social cues. The sound of other people laughing signals that a joke has landed, that the appropriate response to the thing you just watched is amusement. The laugh track does not tell you what was funny. It tells you that something was funny. It does the interpretive work so you do not have to. The theory that has emerged from looking at the laugh track through the lens of the other theories in this script is not a new one, but it is a disturbing one. The laugh track, in any of the constructed reality frameworks we have discussed, is the sound of the constructor, the sound of the mind generating the loop, confirming to itself that each moment of the story is landing the way it was designed to. The laughing is not an audience outside the story. The laughing is something inside it, something integral to the mechanism of the loop itself. In the insane Peter reading, the laugh track is the sound of Peter's own psyche congratulating itself on the fantasy. Each joke that lands, including and especially the jokes that are made at his family's expense, is a moment where the constructed world validates itself. The cruelty toward Meg is funny in this reading, not because cruelty is funny, but because the part of Peter's mind that constructed Meg as a target of cruelty experiences each instance of that cruelty as a successful execution of the punishment. The laugh track is the sound of the punishment working, the sound of the fantasy doing what it was built to do. In the Purgatory reading, the laugh track is something even more unsettling. It is the sound of an external observer. Something that watches the characters cycle through their loop, that watches them fail to change and fail to grow and fail to escape, and finds it amusing. Not cruelly amusing in the way of a malicious observer, but amusing in the way that any story is amusing to someone who knows the outcome already and watches the characters work toward it anyway, unaware that the destination has already been decided. The laugh track in this reading is the sound of an audience that has been watching this story for 25 years and knows every beat of it, watching these characters who do not know it and finding something in their unknowing that is funny in the specific, somewhat melancholy way that comedy built on dramatic irony is always a little sad. There is a version of this reading that goes one step further and locates the laugh track as the sound of the characters themselves, or more specifically, as the sound of the loop's insistence that everything is fine. The laugh track tells you that what you are watching is comedy. It insists on comedy. It will not allow the frame to shift toward tragedy, even in the moments when what is being depicted is, by any reasonable assessment, tragic. The laugh track is the loop's immune system. Anytime the content threatens to break through into something genuinely felt, genuinely painful, genuinely real, the laugh track sounds and the frame snaps back into comedy and the moment passes. Meg's worst moments. The times when her suffering is most clearly and undeniably depicted as suffering rather than comedy. Those moments get the laugh track too. The track sounds over them, the way it sounds over everything else, insisting on the comedy of the frame, insisting that what you are watching is appropriate to laugh at, insisting that the pain is the joke rather than the pain. And the most disturbing thing about this is that it works, because the laugh track is very good at what it does. The frame is very powerful, and most people watching will hear the laugh track and laugh, and move on, and not stop to register that what they just saw was a person experiencing genuine harm. The loop depends on that. The loop needs the audience to keep laughing. Because an audience that stops laughing and starts feeling something more complicated would be an audience that starts asking questions the loop cannot answer, and the loop cannot afford questions. The loop can only afford laughter, so the laugh track sounds, and the moment passes, and the next joke begins. Section 16. The Spooner Street Ecosystem and its Dark Mathematics. There is a question that the show has never addressed directly, but that the fan theory community has been turning over for years, and it goes like this. How many people have died on or because of Spooner Street across the show's 25-year run? And what does that number mean for the people who continue to live there? This is not a frivolous question. The show has, across its run, depicted an extraordinary number of deaths not just in the cutaway gags, which exist in whatever dimension they exist in, but in the main narrative reality of the show's Rhode Island setting. Characters have been killed by Peter's recklessness. Characters have been killed by Stewie's time travel and its side effects. Characters have been killed in the various disasters and confrontations and escalations that the show uses as comedic set pieces. The residents of Spooner Street have been in the immediate vicinity of an enormous amount of lethal events, and they keep living there. They wake up the next episode and Spooner Street is still Spooner Street, the houses are still standing, the neighborhood is still intact. The deaths do not accumulate into a changed world. The disasters do not accumulate into a changed neighborhood. The mathematics of what has happened on that street, if applied to any real-world community, would have made it uninhabitable years ago. But the loop resets, and so the street resets with it. The dark mathematics of Spooner Street become most interesting when you apply them to the character of Joe Swanson. Joe is a police officer. He is the representative of law enforcement in the neighborhood, the character whose professional function is to respond to precisely the kinds of events that keep happening on and around his street. And Joe, despite his professional capabilities, has never been able to significantly alter the trajectory of anything on Spooner Street. The harms that happen in his neighborhood continue to happen. The dangers continue to operate. The mechanisms that produce violence and destruction and pain continue to produce them, episode after episode, and Joe continues to be present and continues to be functionally unable to do anything about them. This could be read as a simple limitation of the character Joe is comedically ineffective despite his competence, which is a standard comedic archetype. But in the Purgatory reading, Joe's inability to change anything is more precisely calibrated. He is the representative of accountability, of consequence, of the force that is supposed to stop harm and produce justice. And in a loop specifically designed to prevent harm from being stopped and justice from being produced, Joe's presence is not ironic. It is essential. The loop needs a representative of accountability present so that the loop's success in defeating accountability can be demonstrated. Joe is there not despite the loop but as part of the loop, the thing that is supposed to stop what cannot be stopped, confirming by his failure that what the loop produces cannot be stopped. The broader ecosystem of Spooner Street, the specific collection of people who live in that small cluster of houses, the specific configuration of personalities and relationships that the show has maintained across 25 years is a precisely tuned instrument. Every character serves a function in relation to every other character, and the functions are designed to be self-sustaining. Peter's recklessness requires Lois's management. Lois's management requires Peter's recklessness to manage. Brian's sophistication requires Peter's vulgarity as a foil. Peter's vulgarity requires Brian's sophistication to comment on it. Quagmire's darkness requires Joe's impotent accountability to be set against it. Meg's suffering requires an audience of people who will not stop it, and the household provides exactly that audience. Remove any one element, and the whole configuration becomes unstable. Which is what happened when Cleveland left. The ecosystem lost a component it needed, and the resulting instability produced a shift in the character of everything that remained. The mathematics of the ecosystem demanded that the loss be compensated for somehow, and the compensation the show found was to make the remaining darkness more concentrated. The cruelty became more intense, the harm became more extreme, the graphic quality of the violence increased. Because the ecosystem was trying to maintain itself with one of its stabilizing elements missing, and the only way to do that was to push the remaining elements further in the direction they were already going. The ecosystem is designed to be self-sustaining. It is designed to maintain its own balance by adjusting the intensity of its components to compensate for losses, which means it can, in principle, continue indefinitely. It can continue as long as the components that remain can continue to compensate for whatever has been lost. And the show has demonstrated, across 25 years, that the capacity for that compensation is enormous. The ecosystem bends, but it does not break. Section 17. What the reset button means for the soul. There is a concept in philosophy of mind called psychological continuity, the idea that what makes you the same person from one moment to the next is not the physical continuity of your body, but the continuity of your memories, your experiences, your sense of self across time. You are the same person who woke up this morning because you remember waking up. You are the same person who had a difficult conversation last year, because the memory of that conversation is part of the continuous stream of experience that constitutes your identity. Remove the continuity, sever the stream, and you have a different question. Is the person who wakes up tomorrow with no memory of today actually you, or are they a different person who happens to occupy the same body? This is a question that philosophers have debated for centuries, but it is also a question that Family Guy has been posing and answering, implicitly, in every episode it has ever aired. The reset between episodes, the return to baseline, the erasure of growth and consequence, the beginning of each new episode in a state functionally identical to the state that preceded the previous one, is not just a production convention. In the context of psychological continuity, it is a statement about the nature of the characters inhabiting the show. If Peter Griffin does not remember, in episode 400, the thing that happened to him in episode 399, that should have changed him if the lesson he learned at the end of episode 399 is gone by the time episode 400 begins. Then is the Peter Griffin of episode 400 the same person as the Peter Griffin of episode 399? The fan theories we have walked through tend to answer this question in ways that are consistent with each other, even when they are not consistent with each other on other points. The purgatory theory says the reset is external, imposed by the mechanism of the loop. The insane Peter theory says the reset is the nature of the constructed fantasy it resets, because the mind generating it cannot maintain continuity indefinitely. The Meg generates reality theory says the reset is the nature of the construction. Meg's world cannot allow the people inside it to change in ways that would permanently alter her experience of them, because their unchanging nature is the thing the construction is modeling. The loop with aware characters theory says the reset is something the characters know is coming, something they experience the end of each episode as a kind of death, a cessation of the continuous self that will reconstitute tomorrow in the same form, with no memory of what was, ready to begin the same story again. This last version is the most disturbing. The characters who are aware of their situation, who know that they are fictional, who know that the writing room manages their fate, who know that the reset is coming experience. The end of each episode as the end of whatever version of themselves that episode has produced. Whatever growth occurred, whatever insight was achieved, whatever relationship deepened during the course of the episode, it ends with the episode. The self that experienced those things does not continue. A new version of the self begins in the next episode, equipped with the same general characteristics and the same general relationships, but without the specific continuity of whatever happened in the previous hour. If you took this literally, if you imagined that the characters experienced the reset as a kind of death, then the existential horror of their situation becomes almost incomprehensible. They have died and been reconstituted hundreds of times. Every time the show has aired a new episode, a version of Peter Griffin has existed for the duration of that episode and then ceased. Every time the credits rolled, whatever that version of Peter had become during the episode stopped being, and a new version began the next week, with no access to what the previous version had experienced. What would it do to a person, even a fictional person, to know that this was happening? What would it do to the sense of self, to the understanding of what matters and what does not, to the ability to invest in relationships and lessons and growth, knowing that the investment would not survive the episode? The fan theory answer, delivered across multiple frameworks, is it would produce exactly the characters we see. People who cannot hold on to growth. People who know, on some level, that investment is futile. People who seem to be going through the motions of emotional experience without fully committing to it, because full commitment would be absurd in a system that resets. The characters are not shallow because they were written shallowly. They are shallow because the system they inhabit makes depth too costly to sustain. Section 18. The Geography of Denial. Quahog, Rhode Island is described in the show's canon as having a population of 800 people. This number was established in the Season 10 episode Tom Tucker, The Man and His Dream. 800 people. That is an extraordinarily small community for a place that appears to have a functioning airport, multiple hospitals, a news station, a brewery that employs hundreds of people, a police department, and enough commercial infrastructure to support the daily operations of what looks, on screen, like a small but functional American city. The population figure does not fit the infrastructure. The infrastructure does not fit the population figure. And the gap between them is a gap that the show has never tried to close, because closing it would require the show to either explain Quahog more specifically than it wants to, or admit that the numbers do not add up. The show has chosen, across its entire run, to simply let the gap exist. The fan theory community has noticed this gap and proposed various explanations for it. The most practically minded explanation is that the 800 figure is simply a joke, a deliberately absurd number placed in the show for comedic effect, not intended to be taken as a serious fact about the world. This is almost certainly the correct production explanation. It was a gag about a small town, not a genuine piece of world building. But the more theoretically inclined corner of the fan community has pointed out that if you take the 800 figure seriously, it produces an implication that is genuinely strange. In a town of 800 people, everyone knows everyone. Every person in Quahog has had sufficient contact with the Griffin family to be directly or indirectly aware of what Peter Griffin is, of what has happened in their neighborhood, of the extraordinary quantity of harm and chaos that originates from one address on Spooner Street. The entire population of the town has witnessed, in some form, the events that the show depicts. And the town continues to function. The town continues to exist around the Griffin household as though everything is normal, as though the events of 25 years of episodes represent an acceptable cost of civic life in Quahog. The grocery store stays open. The bar stays open. The news station continues to report stories that are not about the ongoing disaster that is the Griffin family. The fabric of the community holds. This is, the theory holds, not incidental. This is the deepest form of the complicity that runs through the show at every level. Not just Quagmire's neighbors declining to address what Quagmire is. Not just the Griffin's friends declining to address what Peter is. But the entire town, all 800 people of it, collectively declining to address the reality of what has been happening in their community. The geography of denial encompasses the entire map of the show's world. The 800 people of Quahog have chosen, collectively and continuously, to treat the Griffin household as a known quantity that can be accommodated without acknowledgement. This is the same choice that communities make in the real world when they have decided, for whatever reason, that the cost of acknowledgement is higher than the cost of silence. When the disruption of naming a thing is judged, collectively and without explicit discussion, to be more dangerous than the disruption the thing itself is causing. The town goes on around the Griffin house, the way water goes around a stone, not by the stone becoming less disruptive, but by everything else learning to flow around it. The loop at 31 Spooner Street is sustained not just by the mechanism of the loop itself, but by the consent of the surrounding community. 800 people have agreed, continuously and renewably across 25 years of episodes, to go along with the fiction that everything is fine. That the Griffin house is a normal house on a normal street in a normal town. That the things that happen there are the ordinary things that happen in ordinary places. And that agreement, replicated across the entire population of Quahog, is what gives the loop its stability. The loop does not need to be invulnerable to external pressure. It only needs the external community to never apply it. And the community has been faithfully providing that service since 1999. Section 19. The question of Brian's novel. Brian Griffin has been working on a novel for the entire run of the show. It is, by now, one of the most durable running jokes in all of Family Guy, the novel that is always being written and never being finished, the literary ambition that produces no literary product, the aspiration that is always referenced and never realized. The novel's title changed across various mentions in the show. In one version, it was called Faster Than the Speed of Love. In other contexts, it was simply referred to as the novel, the unnamed thing Brian has been working on for as long as anyone has known him. The fan theory community has spent considerable time on the question of what the novel actually is, or would be, if it were ever finished. Not the content of it, which the show has deliberately kept vague, but the meaning of it. What does it mean that Brian cannot finish the novel? What does it mean that the aspiration persists while the product does not? What does it mean that we have watched a character spend 25 years failing to complete the one thing that would most clearly and most publicly demonstrate that he is who he claims to be? The most surface reading is the simplest one. Brian is not the writer he thinks he is. His pretensions to literary genius outrun his actual talent. The novel cannot be finished because it is not good enough to be finished, because finishing it would require confronting the gap between Brian's self-image and his actual capability, and that confrontation is not something the character can manage. He is a failed writer not because he lacks the time or the discipline, but because he lacks the talent, and his inability to finish the novel is the loop's way of protecting him from having to know that. The alcoholism theory offers a different reading. Brian cannot finish the novel because the disease has eroded the sustained cognitive effort that finishing a novel requires. Writing a novel across its full length requires a kind of continuous, accumulating attention, the ability to hold a long project in mind, to maintain coherent narrative through months or years of writing, to revise and reconsider and develop. These are precisely the cognitive functions that chronic alcohol use degrades. Brian's failure to finish is not evidence of a lack of talent. It is evidence of a disease that has made sustained creative work impossible for him, even as it has left his confidence in his own talent completely intact. The constructed reality theories offer a third reading, one that is stranger and in some ways more interesting than either of the others. In the purgatory framework, the novel is Brian's specific form of the denied desire, the thing he wants most, perpetually within reach and perpetually unreachable, because the loop is designed to keep it that way. His punishment is not just the indignity of being a dog in a world that should take him seriously. His punishment is that the thing that would resolve the indignity, the finished novel, the evidence of his genuine literary capability is always being worked on and never being completed. The aspiration is real. The product is permanently deferred. This is a tailored cruelty for a specific kind of person. Give them the ambition and take away the capacity for completion. In the insane Peter reading, the novel's incompleteness is more poignant. Peter constructed Brian as the intelligent voice he needed in his fantasy. And in Peter's imagining of Brian, Brian has always been about to do something extraordinary. Always about to finish the thing that will vindicate him. Always on the verge of proving that the smart friend in the armchair was as smart as he appeared to be. The novel is the evidence of Brian's potential that Peter's mind keeps generating and withholding, because a finished novel would mean the potential had been realized, and realized potential is not as valuable to the fantasy as potential that remains perpetually possible. The novel cannot be finished because finishing it would transform Brian from a character of unrealized promise into a character with a specific, accessible record. An unrealized promise is more flexible, more useful to the fantasy, than an actual achievement that could be evaluated and found wanting. The novel exists, It will always be in progress. And Brian will always be almost finished with it, always about to complete the thing that would prove who he is, always working on the evidence that never quite gets made. This is not a failing unique to Brian. It is a human failing that the show has been depicting with unusual accuracy for 25 years. The failing of the person who lives more in the aspiration than in the work, who finds the idea of the achievement more comfortable than the reality of it. Brian is every person who has had a great idea and never quite gotten around to making it real. And the laugh track sounds, and the moment passes, and the next episode begins, and the novel is still unfinished on Brian's desk and will be tomorrow and the day after that. Section 20. The final uncomfortable truth. There is a truth about Family Guy that all of the theories in this script have been circling without quite stating directly, and it is a truth worth stating plainly at the end, because it is the thing that gives the theories their power and their persistence. The theories work because the show is honest. Not honest in the sense of being truthful about its characters' better qualities or their capacity for growth. Not honest in the sense of depicting a world that rewards virtue and punishes harm. But honest in the specific, uncomfortable, rarely acknowledged sense of depicting accurately what happens when a system, a family, a community, a loop of any kind is designed to preserve itself rather than to improve itself. Family Guy has been running for 25 years. In that time, it has shown us Peter Griffin cause an enormous amount of harm and face an insufficient amount of consequence for it. It has shown us Meg Griffin absorb an enormous amount of harm and receive an insufficient amount of vindication. It has shown us Brian Griffin choose image over substance across decades and watch that choice compound into something that has cost him everything he said he valued. It has shown us Lois Griffin manage a household that she chose and that she continues to choose. And it has rarely stopped to ask what it means that she keeps choosing it. It has shown us Stewie Griffin possess more power than anyone in the world and use it primarily to maintain a life he did not design and cannot escape. And it has shown us all of this while the laugh track sounds. The theories are the audience's attempt to make the laugh track stop, to pull the show out of the frame of comedy and look at it in a different frame, a frame where what is being depicted is recognized as what it actually is, which is people causing harm and not changing, people being harmed and not being vindicated, systems preserving themselves at the expense of the individuals trapped inside them. The purgatory theory does not add darkness to the show. It names the darkness that was already there. The insane Peter theory does not make the Griffins more tragic. It offers a vocabulary for the tragedy that was already being depicted. The Meg generates reality theory does not transform Meg into a sympathetic figure. She was always a sympathetic figure. It just explains why the show kept treating her as a punchline anyway. Family Guy is funny. It has always been funny, even in its worst seasons, even in its most difficult episodes. The cutaway gags are often genuinely clever. The voice performances are reliably excellent. The show has produced moments of real comedic brilliance across its 25-year run, moments that justify the institution of animated comedy as a form capable of things live action cannot achieve. None of the theories we have discussed erase any of that. But Family Guy is also a 25-year record of what happens when the people inside a system keep making the same choices, keep absorbing the same damage, keep failing to change in ways that would cost them something. And that record is honest in a way that the laugh track tries to prevent you from noticing. The theories notice it. The theories say, we see what you are actually showing us underneath the comedy. We see the Griffins for what they are. We see the loop for what it is. We see the mechanism for what it does. The house on Spooner Street is still there. It will still be there. The family inside it will wake up next week and the week after that, and the loop will run, and the laugh track will sound, and the cutaway gags will land, and whatever the episode is about will be resolved by the end of the episode and forgotten by the start of the next one. And somewhere in the bedroom at the top of the stairs, Stewie Griffin, 1-year-old, creator of the universe, the being whose accident made everything, is building something. He is always building something. He does not stop. Whatever he has decided not to be, whatever version of himself the show has evolved him into across the years, he retains the one thing that defines him most precisely. He does not stop. He keeps working. He keeps making. He keeps imagining something beyond the room he is in, even though the room is all he has ever known and all he will ever be permitted to inhabit. Maybe that is the most honest thing about him, the most human thing about all of them. Not the cruelty, or the pretension, or the invisibility, or the trapped genius, but the fact that they keep going. That even inside a loop, even inside a punishment, even inside a construction that was never designed to allow them to escape or grow or change, they keep going. They wake up, they try again, they fail again. They wake up the next day. The house is still there, the family is still inside it, the machine keeps running, and we keep watching, which might be the most uncomfortable truth of all. Section 21. The Dark Corner's Additional Theories. No catalog of Family Guy theories is ever truly finished. The show has been running long enough and has enough internal mythology to draw from that new theories continue to surface even decades into the show's run. What follows is a collection of additional frameworks, smaller, tighter, more specific, that add texture to the larger picture we have been building. The chicken fight mirrors Peter's death count. Some obsessive fans have cross-referenced the timing of the chicken fight episodes with episodes in which Peter causes significant harm to other characters. The correlation is imperfect, as any pattern found in a show with 400 episodes is likely to be imperfect. But there is a rough correspondence between episodes where Peter does something particularly damaging, where the show depicts him causing harm of a quality and scale that would, in a more accountable world, have serious consequences, and episodes where the chicken fight appears or is referenced, as though the psyche, unable to process the guilt directly, roots it outward into the fight. The chicken absorbs what Peter cannot afford to carry, and the fight never resolves because the guilt never resolves, because the harm was never addressed. Brian's manuscript as autobiography. There is a detail about Brian's unfinished novel, Faster Than the Speed of Love, that the fan community has spent time on. In the Season 9 episode Brian Writes a Bestseller, Stewie reads portions of the manuscript and finds it deeply personal in a way that is played for laughs, but that, taken seriously, is quite revealing. The portions we hear are not fiction in the conventional sense. They read more like thinly veiled autobiography. Characters who map closely onto the Griffins, situations that closely parallel Brian's own experiences. The novel Brian has been writing for 25 years is the story of his own life, which he cannot finish because his own life is not finished, which he cannot publish because publishing it would mean revealing himself in a way the character of Brian is constitutionally unable to do. The novel is not a separate artistic project. The novel is Brian's attempt to understand his own story, and the inability to finish it is the inability to understand that story, to locate its meaning, to see its shape, to know what it is actually about. He keeps writing it because the answer is not yet there. He keeps not finishing it because the answer has not come. The time between cutaways. Here is a question no one ever asks. What do the characters do during the cutaway gags? The show occasionally addresses this in the Back to the Pilot episode. The past characters stand around waiting. But this is treated as a brief comedic note rather than a sustained question. The theory is that the characters experience the time of the cutaway as lost time, as a gap in their consciousness, a period they cannot account for, a moment where they were present in the scene and then suddenly present again in the scene with no memory of what happened in between. The cutaways in this reading are experienced by the characters as blackouts, brief, regular blackouts that they have come to accept as a feature of their lives without understanding what causes them. The fact that they never discuss this, never mention the gaps, never express confusion about the lost time, is itself evidence of how deeply normalized the abnormal has become for the residents of Spooner Street. They do not notice the blackouts anymore. The blackouts are just part of how time works in that place. And they keep going, filling the time between the gaps with the lives the loop provides, waiting for the next one to come. Lois as the architect of the fantasy. There is an alternative to the insane Peter theory that has been quietly developed by a smaller corner of the fan community, one that frames the constructed fantasy not as Peter's creation, but as Lois's. In this reading, it is Lois who broke down, Lois who could not hold reality together, Lois who built the world we are watching. The tragedy that precipitated the breakdown differs in this version. Perhaps the accident involved different people, perhaps the loss was configured differently, perhaps the specific shape of what was taken from her was something other than what the standard version of the theory describes. But the resulting world is the same. A constructed loop, a sustained delusion, a yellow house on a fictional street where the people she loved are still alive. The evidence for this version of the theory is subtle but present. Lois, in the show, is consistently the one character who seems most acutely aware of the gap between what her life is and what it could be. She is the one character for whom the fantasy, if the whole thing is a fantasy, is most clearly a fantasy of choosing love over privilege, of choosing Peter over the Pewterschmidt world, of making the brave romantic choice and having it work out. The show constructed around the Griffins is, if you look at it from this angle, a fantasy of romantic vindication. The girl who married for love rather than money and found that the love was worth it, even through all the difficulties, even through all the chaos, even when the chaos was significant and sustained. That is a fantasy. The specific shape of it is Lois's. In this reading, Peter's incompetence is not Peter's self-punishment. It is Lois's idealization of him, the beloved husband, made larger than life, given impossible qualities of resilience and durability and love, made into something almost mythological in his simple, loyal, bumbling dedication to her. And Meg's treatment in the fantasy is more disturbing for being Lois's work rather than Peter's. A woman who could not save herself, imagining the daughter she could not protect, trapped in the family, absorbing the harm, serving the function that keeps the family's emotional balance. Meg's suffering, in this reading, is not punishment. It is Lois's guilt, externalized, given a face, made visible. The part of Lois that knows she failed, wearing the form of the child who paid the price. The sound of the brewery. There is a theory, quiet and rarely discussed, about the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, the workplace where Peter has spent much of the show's later run. The brewery produces beer. Peter's relationship with beer is one of the show's most consistent elements across all 25 seasons. He drinks it constantly. He works where it is made. His social life revolves around a bar. His leisure time is organized around it. The beer is always present. The theory is not that Peter is an alcoholic. The show does not really engage with that framing in a meaningful way, despite the quantity of beer it depicts him consuming. The theory is that the brewery is the engine of the loop. The thing Peter keeps returning to, keeps consuming, keeps being sustained by, is the product of the place he works. He drinks the beer. The beer keeps him going. The brewery makes more beer. He drinks more. He goes to work. The brewery makes more. This is the most literal version of the closed loop that operates at the center of the show. Peter's consumption is his workplace's production. His workplace's production enables his consumption. He is inside a loop so total that even the basic economics of his daily life are circular. He works to make the thing he consumes, to make it possible to work to make the thing he consumes. It is a closed system. Nothing enters and nothing leaves except the labor that sustains it. And the loop runs. And the loop runs. And the loop runs. Meg at the end. There is a version of the Meg generates reality theory that has a specific and quiet ending, one that the theory's proponents rarely spell out fully, because spelling it out requires confronting something genuinely sad. It goes like this. The world Meg has generated will end when Meg decides to end it. The loop is sustained by her attention, her need, her continued investment in the possibility, however remote that the love she is generating this world to access, will eventually arrive. When that investment ends, when Meg stops believing that the possibility is worth sustaining, the world ends with it. The Griffins go dark. The house on Spooner Street empties. The loop stops running, and Meg is free. The question the theory asks, and does not answer, is whether freedom from the loop is something Meg wants, whether the end of the constructed world, the end of the family, the end of the possibility that the love might finally come is something she would choose, or something she would choose to avoid at whatever cost the avoidance requires. Whether she would rather have the possibility, however painful the conditions of its maintenance, than the certainty of its absence. The show gives you the answer, in the Seahorse Seashell Party episode, in the moment when Meg takes back everything she said and returns to her role. She does not end the world. She continues it. She accepts the cost. The possibility of love, even the possibility of the love she has built an entire construction to access, even the possibility that has never been realized in 25 years of trying, is worth more to her than the freedom of its absence. This is the most human thing the show has ever depicted. And it depicted it while the laugh track sounded. And it moved on. And the next episode began. The house is still there. Meg is still inside it. The loop keeps running. Because she keeps letting it. Section 22. The voices behind the curtain. Seth MacFarlane voices 4 of the show's main characters: Peter Griffin, Brian Griffin, Stewie Griffin, Glenn Quagmire, one man, four voices, four entirely distinct personalities, four entirely distinct internal lives, four characters who interact with each other, who have relationships with each other, who occasionally come into conflict with each other. This fact, which is a production fact, a casting decision, a practical reality of animated television, becomes something more interesting when you apply it to the constructed reality frameworks we have been discussing. Because if the world of Family Guy is a constructed reality generated by some consciousness, and if that consciousness is Seth MacFarlane's, not Peter's, not Meg's, not any characters, but the creator's own, then the fact that one man voices four of the most prominent characters in that world has a specific implication. Seth MacFarlane has, across 25 years of Family Guy, been having a conversation with himself, in public, on television, for hundreds of millions of viewers worldwide. Peter is, by MacFarlane's own accounts and interviews, rooted in a kind of working-class American masculinity that MacFarlane observed rather than inhabited, the kind of man who drinks beer and watches television and operates from instinct rather than reflection. Peter is what Seth MacFarlane looks at and tries to understand. Brian is, by the same accounts, closer to who MacFarlane actually is, the intellectual ambitions, the political views, the specific quality of sophistication that sits alongside an equally specific quality of personal failure. Stewie is the darkest version of the same intelligence, the ambition taken to its extreme, the wit weaponized, the same mind as Brian's but without the pretense of morality that Brian wraps himself in. And Quagmire is the id, the instinctual, unchecked version of every desire that the other three characters manage, suppress, or redirect. Peter, Brian, Stewie, Quagmire. Four aspects of a single creative mind, distributed across four characters who interact in a fictional Rhode Island neighborhood and have been doing so for 25 years. The show is one man arguing with himself, questioning himself, punishing himself, and occasionally forgiving himself, across four distinct personas who do not know they share an origin. The theory that flows from this observation is quiet but persistent. Family Guy is, at its most fundamental level, a sustained act of self-examination, not as a vanity project or as therapy in any clinical sense, but as the thing that extended creative engagement with a single set of characters over a very long period of time naturally becomes. MacFarlane created Peter and Brian and Stewie and Quagmire in 1998. He has been living with them, has been giving them voice, literally, episode after episode for over 25 years. Whatever those characters have become across that time, whatever the arc of their development and deterioration, is in some sense a record of the relationship between MacFarlane and the versions of himself that he initially created. The Peter of 2025 is not the Peter of 1999. The Brian of 2025 is not the Brian of 1999. The changes in the characters, the flanderization, the descent into cruelty, the deterioration that has been documented and mourned by the show's most devoted fans, these are not simply the result of bad creative decisions by a writing room. They are the result of a creative relationship that has persisted across decades, and creative relationships change. The creator changed. The characters changed with him. What they became is, in part, a record of what became of the creator's relationship to the aspects of himself that those characters represent. Brian became more insufferable as the gap between MacFarlane's ambitions and his self-awareness grew wider. Peter became crueler as the show's success made it easier to depict harm without consequence. Stewie became softer as the sharp edges of the early evil genius characterization became harder to sustain across the warmth of the real friendship that had developed between the character and Brian across the show's run. Quagmire became more explicitly terrifying, as the show became more willing to look directly at what it had always been depicting. This is not an accusation against MacFarlane. It is an observation about what happens when a creative person spends 25 years in close relationship with the characters they created. The characters carry things, they develop, they change in ways that reflect not just the creative decisions made about them, but the internal state of the person making those decisions. Family Guy is, in this reading, one of the longest and most sustained acts of creative autobiography in television history, dressed up in the clothing of an animated family comedy so that both the author and the audience can approach it at a comfortable remove. The house on Spooner Street is a room inside Seth MacFarlane's head. The Griffins are aspects of who he is and who he feared he might become. And the show has been running for 25 years because he has not yet finished the conversation with himself that began when he pitched a 15-minute pilot to Fox in May of 1998. When the conversation ends, the show ends. When the show ends, the house empties. When the house empties, whatever the Griffins were, whatever they meant, whatever darkness they carried, whatever truth they were telling about the people who created them and the people who watched them for so long, that truth will be left behind in the archive, in the 400-plus episodes, in the fan theories and the forum threads and the TikTok videos and the long conversations that people have been having about this cartoon for 25 years. The truth will be there, in the record, and the house will be quiet. For the first time in 25 years. Section 23. What makes these theories stick? There is a specific quality to the most disturbing fan theories, not just about Family Guy, but about any long-running piece of culture, and that quality is this. They feel less like interpretations and more like discoveries. Like the theory was already there, waiting inside the material, and the theorist simply found the door and opened it rather than building something new from the outside. The theories about Family Guy have that quality more consistently than almost any other show I can point to. When you read the purgatory theory for the first time, it does not feel like someone imposing a dark framework onto a comedy. It feels like someone noticing something the comedy was always doing. When you read the insane Peter theory, it does not feel like creative misreading. It feels like the most coherent available explanation for a set of facts that the show itself presents without explanation. This is what makes Family Guy unusual among shows with large fan theory communities. The theories are not wishful thinking. They are not the result of audiences projecting meaning onto material that does not contain it. They are readings that the material genuinely supports, that the material sometimes seems to actively invite, that the material occasionally moves so close to confirming that the gap between the theory and the text becomes almost imperceptible. Consider the moment in the Seahorse Seashell Party episode when Meg takes back her confrontation with her family and accepts her role as the household's emotional scapegoat. The show presents this as a kind of resolution. Meg sees that her family needs her in this role, accepts it, and the episode ends with a restored equilibrium. But if you watch the episode knowing about the theories we have discussed, the purgatory reading, the Meg generates reality reading, the reading that locates Meg as the only continuous consciousness in the show, the resolution looks completely different. It does not look like acceptance. It looks like a person who has looked at every available exit and made a deliberate and fully conscious choice to stay. Not because she has been defeated, but because she has decided that the conditions of staying are preferable to the conditions of leaving. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, one of the most complex and human choices a character can make. And the show made it while the laugh track sounded, and moved on, and never revisited it directly. This is what the theories are for. They revisit what the show moved past. They go back to the moments the show decided were resolved, and ask whether they were actually resolved, or whether they were simply declared resolved so that the next episode could begin. They do the work that the loop does not allow the characters to do, the work of remembering, of accumulating, of asking what all of this means across its full length, rather than in the 30-minute window of any individual episode. The theories are the viewer's way of being continuous in a world designed to reset, of carrying forward what the characters cannot, of being the memory that the loop erases every week and refusing to be erased. This is an act of genuine love for the material, not the love that accepts everything uncritically, that defends every choice and dismisses every critique, but the love that looks closely, that asks hard questions, that demands more from a thing than the thing initially seems to offer, and sometimes finds that more is there, buried but real, waiting to be found by whoever is willing to look long enough and carefully enough to see it. Family Guy has been worth looking at for 25 years. The theories are the record of all the looking, and the looking continues, because the house is still there, and there is always more to find inside it. One final observation before we close completely. The show has a spin-off announced for Stewie, a series called Simply Stewie, announced in March of 2026, ordered for 2 seasons by Fox, set to follow Stewie Griffin in preschool, and exploring time and space travel. Seth MacFarlane is co-creating it alongside Kirker Butler. It is set to premiere sometime in the 2027 to 2028 season. Think about what this means within the framework of every theory we have discussed tonight. Stewie is getting his own world, a world outside the loop of 31 Spooner Street, a world where he is not confined to the crib, not trapped in the family dynamic, not permanently 1 year old in a house that never changes. A world where he moves, where the story moves with him, where the reset mechanism that operates on Spooner Street may not apply in the same way. Is this the exit? Is this the door that none of the other theories could locate, not because the door did not exist, but because it required a formal production decision to open it? Stewie, whose intelligence was always the most precisely imprisoned of any characters in the show, whose genius was the most perfectly targeted punishment in whatever punishment system the purgatory theory describes, Stewie is getting out. What he finds on the other side remains to be seen. But the fact that he is going, that the first major exit from the loop of Spooner Street is being given to the being who created the universe, the one who was trapped most precisely in the most helpless form feels, even if it was not intended this way, like something like the loop acknowledging its own limits, like the system making a small, formal gesture toward the possibility of something beyond itself. Like purgatory, in the very specific way that purgatory is supposed to work, beginning finally, after all these years, to let someone through. Stewie is going to preschool. He is going to explore time and space. He is, for the first time in 25 years, leaving the house. The house on Spooner Street will still be there. The machine will still run. The loop will still cycle. Peter and Lois and Meg and Chris and Brian will still wake up every week in the same yellow house on the same street, performing the episodes written for them, returning to the baseline at the end of each one. But Stewie will be somewhere else. And whatever that means in the theories, in the mythology, in the quiet space where the show does more than it knows it is doing, it means something. The creator of the universe is leaving home. The loop goes on without him. And whatever comes next begins. That is everything. Every theory, every thread, every quiet wrongness buried in the yellow house on Spooner Street. Drop a comment and tell me which one is still sitting with you, and tell me where in the world you are watching from. It matters more than you think to know who is out there. If this was the kind of thing worth coming back to, a subscription costs nothing and helps more than you know. Good night.